Hello everyone. I know you used this video to fall asleep, but before you do, let me know where you're from and what time you're watching. Now just get cozy and enjoy. When I took the job as the head coach for the local junior hockey team, the Winchester Wolves, I thought it would be a fresh start. I had been away from the game for a while, nursing old injuries and even older regrets. Coaching seemed like a way to reconnect with the sport I loved without the pain of competition. It was supposed to be straightforward, a way to pass on what I knew to the next generation. But like most things in life, it didn't turn out that way. It started off well enough. The boys were good kids, eager to learn and passionate about the game. They had raw talent, but they needed discipline, coordination, and a sense of unity. I spent the first few weeks getting to know each of them, watching how they played, and figuring out where they needed improvement. That's when I noticed him. His name was Ethan. He wasn't the biggest or the fastest on the team, but there was something about the way he skated. It was like he wasn't even trying, yet he was always ahead, always where he needed to be, as if he knew the play before it happened. It was subtle at first, a split-second advantage, a preternatural awareness of where the puck would go. I chalked it up to intuition, a natural gift that some players just had. But there was something else, something I couldn't put my finger on. One evening, after practice, I stayed back to clean up. The ice was smooth and freshly resurfaced, reflecting the bright lights of the rink. As I picked up stray pucks, I glanced around and noticed something odd. Ethan had stayed late, skating laps around the rink. His form was perfect, almost too perfect. And then I saw it. His skates weren't leaving any marks on the ice. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but no matter how closely I looked, the ice remained unbroken. Every other player left visible grooves, even when they barely brushed the surface. But not Ethan. He glided over the ice as if he was floating just above it. I shook my head, rubbed my eyes, and when I looked again, he was gone. I dismissed it as exhaustion, maybe even a bit of imagination running wild after a long day. But a seed of unease had been planted, and it only grew as the days passed. It wasn't long before I started hearing whispers among the players. They didn't say anything directly to me, but I caught snippets of conversations in the locker room. They were talking about Ethan, about how he never seemed tired, how he always knew where to be, how he never missed a shot. It wasn't admiration in their voices, it was fear. I pulled aside one of the older boys, Kyle, and asked him what was going on. At first he was reluctant, but eventually he opened up. "It's Ethan, coach," he said, glancing over his shoulder as if he was afraid someone might be listening. "There's something off about him. It's like he's not really there, you know?" "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, though my heart was pounding in my chest. "He doesn't talk much. And when he does, it's like he's not sure what to say, like he's pretending to be one of us. And then there's the ice." "The ice?" Kyle nodded, looking pale. "Yeah, haven't you noticed? His skates don't leave any marks. It's like he's not even touching it." I felt a chill run down my spine. I wanted to tell Kyle he was imagining things, that it was just a coincidence, but I had seen it too. I tried to brush it off, but the unease lingered. The more I watched Ethan, the stranger things became. He always arrived first and left last, but no one ever saw him change in the locker room. His skates were always pristine, as if they'd never touched the ice. And he was getting faster, more agile, to the point where it seemed almost unnatural. One night, after a particularly grueling practice, I decided to confront him. I found him alone in the rink, skating in circles. I called out to him, and he stopped abruptly, turning to face me. There was a hollow look in his eyes, something I hadn't noticed before. "Ethan, can I talk to you for a minute?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded silently and skated over to me. Up close, I could see how pale he was, his skin almost translucent under the harsh lights. "Is everything okay?" I asked. "You've been playing great, but there's something different about you. The other guys are worried." He stared at me for a long moment before speaking, his voice low and distant. "I just want to play, coach. That's all I've ever wanted." His words sent a shiver down my spine. There was something wrong here, something I couldn't explain. I nodded slowly, not knowing what else to say. "Okay, but if you need to talk, I'm here." He gave me a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Thanks, coach. But I'm fine." As he skated away, I noticed it again. No marks, no sign that he had ever been there. It was like watching a ghost glide across the ice. I couldn't let it go. The next day, I did some digging. I looked up Ethan's records, trying to find something that would explain the oddities. But there was almost nothing. He had joined the team halfway through the season, transferred from a school upstate. His file was sparse, just a name and basic stats. No photos, no medical records, nothing personal. I called the school he supposedly transferred from, but they had no record of him. It was like he didn't exist. My heart pounded as I hung up the phone. What the hell was going on? I decided to talk to Ethan's parents, but when I drove to the address listed in his file, I found an empty lot. There was no house, no sign that there had ever been one. I felt a surge of panic. Who was this kid? And why was he on my team? Things came to a head one night during a game. We were down by 1, and the team was struggling. Ethan had been quiet the whole game, almost invisible. But then, in the last few minutes, he came alive. He took the puck, weaving through the opposing players like they weren't even there. He scored the tying goal, then the winning one, all in the span of a few seconds. The crowd went wild, but I felt a sense of dread. I looked at the ice and saw it again, no marks. The other players had left the surface scared and grooved, but where Ethan had skated, the ice was smooth and untouched. After the game, I tried to talk to him, but he was gone. I asked the other players if they'd seen him, but no one had. It was like he had vanished into thin air. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about Ethan, about the way he moved, the hollow look in his eyes. I needed answers, so I went back to the rink, hoping to find something that would explain what was happening. The rink was dark and empty, the ice gleaming under the dim lights. I stepped onto the ice, feeling the cold seep through my shoes, and then I saw him. Ethan was standing at the far end of the rink, his back to me. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. I skated over, my heart pounding in my chest. "Ethan, what's going on? Who are you?" I demanded. He turned slowly, and I saw the truth in his eyes. They were empty, hollow sockets staring back at me. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He raised his hand, pointing to something behind me. I turned and saw them, shadows, dozens of them, moving across the ice. They were the silhouettes of players, all wearing the same jersey, all faceless. They skated around me, their movements smooth and silent, leaving no marks on the ice. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Ethan watched me, his expression unreadable. And then he spoke, his voice echoing in the empty rink. "We just want to play, coach. That's all we've ever wanted." I turned and ran, slipping and sliding across the ice. The shadows followed, their cold presence pressing in around me. I made it to the exit, slamming the door behind me, my heart hammering in my chest. I left the team the next day, packed up, and never looked back. I don't know what happened to Ethan or the rest of the boys. I don't want to know. All I know is that there are things out there, things that don't belong in this world, things that wear the faces of people we think we know. I never told anyone what I saw that night. Who would believe me? A coach scared off by shadows on the ice. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, late at night, I think about Ethan, about the way he skated, always ahead of the team, always leaving no trace behind. And I wonder if he's still out there somewhere, skating circles around an empty rink, waiting for the next game, waiting for the next coach to take a chance on a kid who just wants to play. And I hope, whoever that coach is, that they're smarter than I was, because some games you just can't win, no matter how hard you try. I've been a ski instructor in the Rockies for over a decade, and you'd think I've seen it all by now. But this winter, something happened that still makes my blood run cold every time I think about it. It was late January, and the resort was packed with tourists trying to make the most of the heavy snowfall we'd gotten that week. The conditions were perfect, almost too perfect. You see, when the snow is fresh like that, it's beautiful but also dangerous. Avalanches become a real risk, especially in the off-piste areas where the snow is untouched. It was a typical morning. I was on my way to the lodge for my first lesson of the day when I noticed a group of skiers huddled together, talking in hushed voices. Curious, I skied over to see what was going on. "Morning, folks. Everything all right?" I asked. They turned to me, looking pale and uneasy. One of them, a middle-aged guy with a nervous expression, pointed towards the tree line off to the side of the main slope. "Over there, by those trees. We saw something weird," he said. I followed his gaze and spotted a set of footprints in the snow, leading away from the designated trails and heading straight into the backcountry. The tracks were strange. They were deep and spaced far apart, like whoever made them was either really heavy or carrying something. "Did you see who made these?" I asked, squinting at the tracks. They all shook their heads. Another woman spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. "We were on the lift and saw the footprints appear out of nowhere. There was no one there, just the tracks." Now, I've heard some crazy stories from tourists, especially after they've had a few drinks at the lodge, but this was different. The fear in their eyes was real. I nodded, trying to keep my own voice steady. "All right, I'll check it out. You guys go back to the lodge, okay?" They hesitated but eventually shuffled away, casting nervous glances over their shoulders. I took a deep breath and skied over to where the tracks began. They started just beyond the marked boundary of the resort, which was already odd. It was like someone had just dropped out of the sky and started walking. I followed the footprints cautiously, my skis crunching softly in the untouched snow. The tracks led further and further away from the safety of the groomed trails, winding through dense trees and over small ridges. As I moved deeper into the backcountry, an eerie silence settled around me. The kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes you feel like you're being watched. After about 15 minutes, I found myself standing at the edge of a steep slope, looking down into a narrow valley. The tracks continued down, heading straight towards a notorious avalanche zone. It was an area no one in their right mind would enter, especially not alone and on foot. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone emerge from the trees, but there was no one. Just the wind whispering through the branches and the faint creak of snow shifting under its own weight. My heart started to pound as I stared at the footprints. They looked fresh, but how could that be? I pulled out my radio and called it in, my voice coming out shakier than I would have liked. "Dispatch, this is Jake. I'm at the boundary of the West Ridge off-piste area. I found a set of footprints leading into the avalanche zone. No sign of the person. Over." There was a crackle of static before a voice responded. "Copy that, Jake. Are you sure? It's a restricted area. Nobody should be out there." "Yeah, I'm sure. The tracks are fresh, and they lead right down into the valley." There was a long pause before the dispatcher spoke again. "Okay, Jake. We're sending a search team to your location. Don't go any further. It's too dangerous." "Understood," I replied, my eyes still glued to the tracks disappearing into the distance. I stood there, waiting, my mind racing with possibilities. Who would be crazy enough to venture into an avalanche zone? And why? My thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, distant rumble. I looked up, eyes widening as I saw a massive cloud of snow begin to roll down the mountainside on the other side of the valley. "Avalanche." I shouted into the radio, my voice breaking. "There's an avalanche coming down the north face." I watched, helpless, as the wall of snow rode down the slope, swallowing everything in its path. It was a terrifying sight, and I could feel the ground trembling beneath my feet as the avalanche surged forward. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. A deafening silence followed, and the valley was buried under a thick blanket of snow. I waited, breathless, until the search team arrived. We combed the area as best we could, but there was nothing, no sign of anyone. The footprints had vanished under the avalanche's weight, leaving nothing but a smooth, undisturbed surface. The team leader, a seasoned veteran named Greg, shook his head grimly as we stood at the edge of the devastation. There's no way anyone could have survived that. If there was someone out here, they're gone now. I nodded, swallowing hard. It didn't make sense. The footprints had been so fresh. How could someone just vanish like that? The incident was reported, and for a while, it became a bit of a local legend. People whispered about the ghostly tracks that led into the avalanche zone, about how no one was ever found. But as the season went on, the story faded, replaced by new tales and the usual gossip that circulates in ski towns. I tried to put it behind me, but something about those tracks haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it, that whoever or whatever made those footprints was still out there. A few weeks later, I found myself back in the same area alone again. I hadn't planned to go back, but something drew me there like an itch I couldn't scratch. The snow had melted and refrozen several times since the avalanche, and the landscape looked different, almost unfamiliar. I skied down cautiously, my eyes scanning the ground for any sign of the footprints. I reached the spot where I had last seen them, my breath catching in my throat as I realized something. There, faint but unmistakable, were the tracks. They were right where they had been before, leading away from the trees and down into the valley. But this time, they were different. They were deeper, more pronounced, like whoever made them was struggling. My heart pounded as I followed them, the cold air biting at my cheeks. The tracks led me further down, past the spot where the avalanche had buried everything. I should have turned back, but I couldn't. I had to know. The footprints continued, winding through the valley and up a small hill on the other side. As I reached the top, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a small cabin. It was old and weathered, half buried in snow, with a sagging roof and boarded-up windows. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, yet the footprints led straight to the door. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn around and leave, but something compelled me to move forward. I approached the cabin slowly, my skis sinking into the deep snow. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The air was stale and cold, and a musty smell filled my nose. I looked around, my eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls. The cabin was empty, just a single room with an old, dusty bed and a broken chair. But then I noticed something strange. In the middle of the floor, there were more footprints. They circled around the room, leading to a small trapdoor in the corner. My heart raced as I walked over, my legs feeling like lead. I knelt down and reached for the handle, my breath catching in my throat. With a creak, the trapdoor opened, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the earth. A wave of fear washed over me, but I couldn't stop now. I had to know what was down there. I took a deep breath and descended, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. The staircase seemed to go on forever, winding deeper and deeper into the mountain. I lost track of time, my mind consumed by the darkness pressing in around me. Finally, I reached the bottom and found myself standing in a narrow tunnel. The walls were rough and damp, and the air was thick with the smell of earth and decay. I moved forward, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning like a labyrinth. And then I saw it. At the end of the tunnel, there was a small, dimly lit chamber. In the center of the room stood a figure, its back turned to me. It was tall and gaunt, its skin pale and translucent like ice. My heart pounded as I watched it, unable to move or speak. The figure turned slowly, and I felt a scream rise in my throat as I saw its face. It was a twisted, distorted version of my own, its eyes hollow and empty, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. The figure stepped towards me, its movements slow and deliberate. I turned and ran, the tunnel closing in around me as I fled. I could hear it behind me, its footsteps echoing in the darkness, getting closer and closer. I reached the stairs and scrambled up, my hands slipping on the cold, damp wood. I burst through the trapdoor and slammed it shut, my chest heaving as I leaned against it, gasping for breath. I glanced around, my eyes wild. The cabin was empty, just as I had left it. But something was different. The air felt heavier, the shadows darker. I knew I had to get out of there. I stumbled out of the cabin and into the snow, my legs shaking. I didn't look back as I skied away, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the lodge, collapsing in the snow outside. I don't know what I saw that day or what happened in that cabin. All I know is that I was never the same after that. I tried to forget, to move on, but the memory haunted me, lurking in the back of my mind like a shadow I couldn't escape. I quit my job as a ski instructor and left the mountains, but the fear followed me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that twisted face, those hollow eyes staring back at me. I could still hear the footsteps echoing in the darkness. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself wondering about those footprints. Who made them? Where did they lead? And what was that thing in the cabin? I guess I'll never know. But one thing is certain. Whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting, watching. And I pray I never see it again. I never thought a simple shopping trip could turn into a nightmare. My life was as mundane as it gets. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. I didn't have much to worry about. But then, everything changed with that one item. It started on a lazy Sunday afternoon. I needed some groceries, and the local supermarket was my go-to place. It was always crowded, but I didn't mind. It gave me a chance to blend in, to be just another face in the crowd. That day, I had a short list: bread, milk, eggs, and some snacks. Simple enough. As I walked down the aisles, I noticed something odd in my cart. There was an old, dusty book sitting on top of my groceries. It was small, with a tattered leather cover and no title. I don't remember picking it up, and it didn't look like something I'd be interested in. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe someone had left it there by mistake. I put the book back on a random shelf and continued shopping. I didn't think much of it until I reached the checkout. There it was again, sitting on top of my items. I laughed nervously and showed it to the cashier. "I don't know how this got in my cart," I said, handing it to her. She gave me a weird look but took the book and placed it under the counter. I paid for my groceries, and that was that. Or so I thought. When I got home and started unpacking, my heart skipped a beat. The book was there, sitting on my kitchen counter as if it had been waiting for me. I backed away, my hands trembling. There was no logical explanation for this. I hadn't bought it, and I was sure I left it at the store. I didn't know what to do, so I did what anyone would in my situation. I threw it in the trash and tried to forget about it. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the book, its cracked cover and yellowed pages haunting my thoughts. I told myself it was just my imagination. It had to be. The next day, I went back to the store. I needed to clear my head, and running errands seemed like a good distraction. I was browsing the cereal aisle when I felt a familiar chill down my spine. I looked down, and there it was again, the book, lying in my cart. I felt my heart race. This was impossible. I had thrown it away, hadn't I? I picked it up, my fingers trembling, and flipped through the pages. They were blank, completely blank. My pulse pounded in my ears as I shoved it onto a shelf and walked away quickly. I couldn't focus for the rest of my shopping trip. My eyes kept darting around, looking for any sign of the book, but it was gone. I paid for my groceries and practically ran out of the store. I was halfway home when I glanced in the rearview mirror. My blood ran cold. The book was sitting on the back seat, propped up like it was a passenger. I slammed on the brakes and swerved to the side of the road. My hands were shaking as I opened the car door and grabbed the book. I hurled it into the bushes, my breath coming in ragged gasps. This wasn't normal. Something was very, very wrong. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to answer. That night, I locked all my doors and windows. I even double-checked them. I was paranoid, but who could blame me? I crawled into bed, exhausted but unable to sleep. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every shadow seemed like it was creeping closer. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint rustling noise coming from the living room. My heart pounded as I crept out of bed, clutching a flashlight like a weapon. I tiptoed down the hall, the beam of light shaking in my hand. When I reached the living room, I froze. There on the coffee table was the book. It was open, the pages fluttering as if a breeze was blowing through the room. But there was no wind, no open windows. I felt a scream rising in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I didn't know what to do. I was terrified, but I had to know what was happening. I walked over to the book and looked at the pages. Words had appeared, written in a neat, old-fashioned script. "You cannot escape." I stumbled back, my mind reeling. This had to be a prank, some kind of sick joke. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I could feel something watching me, something that wasn't human. I grabbed the book and ran to the backyard. I dug a hole, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the shovel. I threw the book in and covered it with dirt, hoping that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. The next day, it was back in my house, sitting on the kitchen table like it belonged there. The words had changed. "Why are you running?" I felt like I was losing my mind. I tried everything, burning it, tearing it to shreds, even throwing it in the river. But no matter what I did, it always came back, and each time, The messages grew more sinister. Come closer. Let me in. You cannot hide. It was relentless, and I was trapped. I stopped going to the store. I stopped leaving the house. I barely ate or slept. My life became a waking nightmare, consumed by the book and its terrifying messages. I knew it was wearing me down, breaking me bit by bit. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront whatever was haunting me. I sat in front of the book, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The pages turned on their own, flipping wildly before stopping on a blank page. Slowly, words began to form. You. I felt a cold dread wash over me. I was in over my head, dealing with something far beyond my understanding. But I couldn't back down now. I had to know. Why? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The book seemed to shiver, the pages rippling as the words appeared. You brought me here. You opened the door. I racked my brain, trying to remember. Had I done something to invite this? I couldn't think of anything, but the book wouldn't lie. It was feeding on my fear, growing stronger every day. Please just leave me alone, I begged. But the book didn't answer. Instead, it flipped to the last page, the paper crackling ominously. One final message appeared. Your story ends tonight. I felt a surge of terror so strong it nearly knocked me off my feet. I grabbed the book and ran outside, not caring where I was going. I just needed to get away. I ran through the dark streets, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of town, the old abandoned quarry looming before me. I hurled the book into the darkness, my scream echoing in the silence. I stood there, my chest heaving, waiting for something to happen. But there was nothing. Just silence and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I thought it was over. I thought I was free. I turned to leave, and that's when I felt it, a hand on my shoulder, cold and clammy. I froze, too terrified to move. Slowly, I turned around. There was no one there, just the empty darkness and the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. But I could feel it, something watching me, something waiting. I backed away, my eyes darting around. And then I saw it. The book was lying on the ground, its cover open wide like a gaping mouth. The pages were filled with my words, my desperate pleas and terrified whispers. It was my story, written in blood-red ink. I realized then that I could never escape. It wasn't just the book that was cursed. It was me. I had become a part of it, my life bound to its pages. I ran, stumbling blindly through the darkness. But no matter how far I went, I could still feel it, following me, haunting me, pulling me back. I could see the words forming in my mind, the final chapter of my life being written. And then, just like that, I was back at my house, standing in front of the door. My hands were shaking as I reached for the handle, but I couldn't stop myself. I opened the door and stepped inside, the book lying open on the floor, waiting for me. I picked it up, my heart heavy with dread. There was one last message scrawled across the page. Welcome home. The door slammed shut behind me, and I knew I was trapped. I was never going to leave. This was my life now, my story, my nightmare. The book was my prison, and I was its prisoner. And as I felt the darkness closing in around me, I realized the terrible truth. Some stories don't have happy endings. Some stories never end. I've always believed that comedy is a tricky business. You can make people laugh all you want, but at the end of the day, if you cross a line, you're toast. My name is Luke Harrison, and I've been in the stand-up comedy scene for about 5 years now. I've had my share of ups and downs, but I never imagined that one day the jokes I told could be lethal. It all started about 3 months ago. I was preparing for a big gig at the Laugh Factory, one of the most prestigious comedy clubs in town. I'd been struggling to come up with new material, and the pressure was getting to me. Then, one night, as I was scrolling through my emails, I found a new message in my inbox. The subject line read, "A gift for the funny man." Curious, I opened it. The email contained a list of jokes, each one better than the last. I didn't think much of it at first. Comedians often share jokes, and sometimes people sent me their material, hoping I'll use it. But this email was different. There was no sender's name, no address, nothing. Just those jokes. I was desperate, so I decided to test them out. The next night, during my set, I slipped one of them in. It was a joke about a guy getting lost in a revolving door. Silly, but it killed. The audience roared with laughter. I felt a rush of relief. Maybe this set wasn't going to be a disaster after all. But then, I noticed something strange. A man sitting near the front row suddenly looked pale. He clutched his chest and collapsed. Panic spread through the club. Someone called for an ambulance, but it was too late. The man had a heart attack and died right there in front of me. I was shaken, but I tried to rationalize it. The guy must have had a pre-existing condition, right? It wasn't my fault, just a coincidence. That's what I told myself as I went home that night. The next morning, another email arrived. The subject line was the same. A gift for the funny man. This time, the jokes were even better. I hesitated, but I was hooked. The laughs from the night before still echoed in my mind. Maybe the guy's heart attack was just a freak accident. So, I used another joke from the email in my next show. It was about a woman who couldn't tell the difference between her husband and her dog. Dark, but it got the audience rolling. For a moment, I was back in my element. But then, just like before, something went wrong. A woman in the audience stood up, gasping for air. Her face turned red, then purple. People around her started screaming for help. She was choking. They managed to get her out of the club, but she didn't make it. 2 people, 2 nights, 2 jokes. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't stop. The emails kept coming, and every time I used a joke, the audience went wild. And then someone died. I tried to tell myself it wasn't the jokes, that I was just imagining things. But the pattern was too clear to ignore. Each time I used one of those mysterious jokes, something bad happened to someone in the audience. I decided to stop using them. I went back to my old material, but the crowd didn't respond the same way. I bombed every night. I was on the brink of giving up when another email arrived. This one was different. The subject line read, "The Grand Final." The email contained a single joke, but it was the best one yet. It was so dark, so twisted, that I knew it would bring the house down. I was terrified, but at the same time, I felt a compulsion to use it. It was like I was addicted to the laughter, even if it meant risking lives. I spent the whole day agonizing over what to do. I knew I should just delete the email, but I couldn't. That night, as I stood on stage, I felt like I was standing at a crossroads. The crowd was restless, waiting for me to make them laugh. I took a deep breath and started my set with my usual material. The audience was lukewarm at best. And then I gave in. I told the joke. It was about a comedian who received jokes in his email that he hadn't written, and every time he used one, something bad happened to a member of the audience. The crowd was silent for a moment, and then they exploded with laughter. It was the biggest reaction I'd ever gotten. But then chaos erupted. People started screaming. Someone at the back of the room began convulsing. Another person collapsed, blood streaming from their nose. It was as if a wave of darkness had swept over the club. I stood there frozen as people ran for the exits. By the time the paramedics arrived, it was too late for most of them. 23 people died that night. I've never been on stage since. I tried to go to the police to tell them what happened, but what could I say? That my jokes were cursed. That an anonymous email was sending me material that killed people. They'd lock me up for sure. The emails stopped after that night. For a while, I thought I was free. But then, about a week ago, I found another message in my inbox. This time, the subject line read, "It's your turn." There was no joke in the email, just a single sentence. "You laughed at their pain. Now it's time for you to feel it." Since then, strange things have been happening. I hear laughter when there's no one around. My reflection in the mirror doesn't match my movements, and sometimes I see faces in the shadows, people from that night, watching me waiting. I know I'm not safe. I can feel it closing in on me, whatever it is. I don't sleep anymore, and I can't eat. I feel like I'm unraveling. Last night, I got another email. This one had no subject line, no body text, just an attachment. I knew I shouldn't open it, but I did. It was a video. It showed me on stage, telling that final joke. I watched as the audience laughed, as they screamed as they died. And then, the camera zoomed in on my face. I looked different. My eyes were hollow, and I was smiling in a way I'd never smiled before. It was like I was feeding on their fear, their pain. The video ended with a message. "You've become the joke, Luke." And the punchline is coming. I don't know what to do. I can't run and I can't hide. I'm trapped in this nightmare and I know there's only one way it ends. I'm the final act, the last joke. I've started hearing whispers at night, voices telling me to go back on stage to tell one last joke. I know if I do, it'll be the end of me. But maybe that's what I deserve. After all, I'm the one who laughed while they died. So here I am, typing this out as a warning. If you ever get an email with jokes you didn't write, delete it. Burn your computer if you have to. Don't end up like me. The screen is flickering now, and I can see them behind me, those faces from the video, waiting for the punchline. I can feel my hands shaking, my heart pounding. I'm terrified, but I'm also relieved. Maybe this is how it was always supposed to end. The last joke is on me. I've been working as a train conductor for almost 2 decades, and I've seen my fair share of strange things. But nothing prepared me for what started happening after they shut down the last night train. I was reassigned to the station maintenance crew, and every night it was my job to make sure the platforms were empty and the station locked up tight. It was quiet, almost too quiet sometimes. The kind of silence that makes you think twice about staying alone. The night it all began, I was making my rounds. The station was old, built back when steam engines still ran the tracks, and it had this eerie, timeless quality to it. It didn't help that they'd cut back on the lights to save on electricity, leaving most of the station in shadow. I was just about to head back to my office when I noticed something odd on one of the benches. A small, crumpled piece of paper. I picked it up, feeling the texture between my fingers. It was a ticket stub. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe someone had dropped it during the day. But then I looked closer. The date was from the night before, and the train number printed on it. It was the same train that had been discontinued a year ago. I shrugged it off at first. Maybe it was some kid playing a prank. But the next night, there was another stub. Same seat, same train number, same date. I felt a chill run down my spine. It couldn't be a coincidence. I decided to keep the stub, tucking it into my jacket pocket as I finished my shift. The following night, I walked straight to the bench. My heart was racing. I don't know why, but I just had this feeling something was off. And sure enough, there it was. Another ticket stub. The date had changed again, and it was for that night. I could almost feel my pulse in my throat as I picked it up, the paper almost warm to the touch. I took it back to my office, staring at it under the fluorescent light. It made no sense. How could these tickets be appearing for a train that wasn't running anymore? I decided I had to find out for myself. I checked the train schedule. The last train to ever run that route had been number 307. It used to leave the station at midnight and arrive at its final stop around 3 a.m. But that train had been out of service for years, ever since the accident. I started coming in earlier, around 11:30 p.m., just to see if anything happened. I'd sit in the station office, sipping my coffee, staring at the old clock on the wall. Midnight would come and go, and nothing would happen. I'd check the bench. No stub. Then, just as I'd start to think it was over, I'd find another one. It was almost like clockwork. A few minutes after midnight, there'd be a stub on that bench, as if someone, or something, was leaving it there for me to find. My coworkers laughed it off when I told them. "You're just seeing things," they said. "That station's so old it's probably haunted." Haunted. The word stuck in my head, nagging at me like an itch I couldn't scratch. The station had its share of ghost stories. People claimed to see shadowy figures on the platforms or hear voices whispering when no one was around. But I'd never believed in any of that, until now. One night, I decided I had to know for sure. I waited until after midnight, hiding behind one of the old ticket kiosks. My heart was pounding in my chest as I watched the bench. At first, there was nothing, just the sound of the wind outside, the distant hum of the city. And then I saw him. He looked normal enough at first glance. Just a man in a long coat, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He walked slowly, almost aimlessly, like he was lost. He stopped by the bench, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a ticket. He placed it carefully on the seat, then turned and walked toward the tracks. My legs felt like lead as I stepped out from my hiding spot. I had to see where he was going. I followed him to the edge of the platform, but when I got there, he was gone. Just vanished into thin air. I stood there, staring at the empty tracks, my mind racing. Had I just seen a ghost? It felt ridiculous, but what else could it be? I picked up the ticket he'd left behind. The date was that night, the time was 12:15 a.m., and the destination, it wasn't a place I recognized. It just said, "Final stop." I spent the next few days researching. I dug through old newspapers, scouring them for any mention of the train or the accident. I found it buried in the back pages of a paper from 20 years ago. There'd been a derailment on the old line, late at night. The train had gone off the tracks, and most of the passengers hadn't made it. The article mentioned something strange, though. They'd never found the conductor. He'd just disappeared along with a handful of passengers. They were presumed dead, but their bodies were never recovered. The story sent a chill down my spine. What if that man I saw was the conductor? What if he was still trying to finish his final journey? I couldn't get it out of my head. I started seeing him everywhere. A shadow in the corner of my eye, a figure standing just out of reach. And always, the ticket stub on the bench, waiting for me. It was driving me crazy. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. All I could think about was that train, that ghostly conductor. I knew I had to do something. So, one night, I made a decision. I was going to get on that train. I waited until midnight, standing on the platform with my heart in my throat. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe I thought I'd just see it coming down the tracks, some old ghost train rolling through the station. But when I heard the whistle, I almost jumped out of my skin. It was distant at first, then closer, echoing through the empty station. The ground beneath my feet began to shake as the train pulled in. It was like something out of a dream, old and faded, like a photograph come to life. The doors slid open, and there he was, the conductor. He looked at me, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in his eyes. A glimmer of recognition, maybe. Or was it relief? He didn't say a word, just nodded toward the open door. My legs felt like jelly as I stepped onto the train. The inside was dimly lit, the seats covered in dust. I could almost feel the weight of the years pressing down on me as I walked down the aisle. There were people sitting there, or at least they looked like people. They were blurry, their faces indistinct, like they were half-forgotten memories. They didn't look at me as I passed. They just stared ahead, waiting. I found an empty seat and sat down, clutching the ticket stub in my hand. The train started moving, the world outside blurring into darkness. I don't know how long I sat there, listening to the sound of the wheels on the tracks. It felt like hours, or maybe just minutes. Time didn't seem to mean anything. The train began to slow, the screech of the brakes echoing through the empty cars. I looked out the window, but there was nothing there, just darkness. The conductor walked down the aisle, stopping by my seat. He held out his hand, and I gave him the ticket. He looked at it, then back at me. "This is your stop," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I stood up, my legs shaking as I made my way to the door. It slid open, and I stepped out onto the platform. The train pulled away, the whistle echoing into the night. I was alone, standing in the darkness, the station a distant memory. And then I realized I wasn't alone. There were others there, standing in the shadows. I could barely see their faces, but I knew they were watching me, waiting. I turned to look at the train, but it was gone, swallowed up by the night. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the darkness. It felt like forever. And then I heard it. The sound of footsteps, getting closer. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest. A figure stepped out of the shadows, and I felt a scream rising in my throat. It was me. I woke up on the platform, the cold concrete pressing against my cheek. The station was empty, the lights flickering overhead. I pushed myself up, my head spinning. Was it all a dream? It felt so real. I looked around, and then I saw it. A ticket stub lying on the bench. My hand was shaking as I picked it up. The date was for that night, and the destination was Final Stop. My breath caught in my throat as I turned it over. On the back, written in neat, looping letters, was a message for the next conductor. I stood there, the ticket clutched in my hand, my mind racing. Was that it? Was I the next conductor? I turned toward the tracks, and in the distance I heard it. The faint sound of a train whistle echoing through the night. I don't know what happened to me after that. Maybe I'm still here, waiting for the next passenger. Or maybe I'm on that train, riding the rails to nowhere. But I know one thing for sure. The train's still running, and every night, a new ticket stub appears on that bench, waiting for someone to find it. I always loved the delicate dance of pen and ink on parchment. The subtle scratch of the nib, the way the ink bled into the fibers, creating something permanent and beautiful. I had been a calligrapher for years, ever since I was a teenager, fascinated by the curves and flourishes of letters. But what happened recently has shaken me to my core. It started with a commission, an ordinary one like any other. A woman, pale and thin, approached me with a request. She wanted a series of letters written to her estranged family members. She provided the content herself, all in her tiny, neat handwriting. There were 5 letters in total, each one addressed to a different person: her brother, her mother, her ex-husband, a childhood friend, and the last one, curiously, to herself. She paid generously, much more than I usually charged. When I asked her why, she said something that felt odd at the time, though I didn't dwell on it much. "The words need to last, Mr. Parker. They must never be forgotten." I shrugged it off as a sentimental request and agreed to complete the letters within a week. The woman left without another word, leaving me with the scripts and a sense of unease I couldn't shake. I started the work the next day. Everything went smoothly. My pen glided across the page, the ink flowed steadily, and the letters formed beautifully under my hand. But as I finished the first letter, something strange happened. The ink, which was supposed to be permanent, began to fade right before my eyes. Within minutes, the entire letter disappeared, except for one word: remember. I stared at the parchment, dumbfounded. I had never seen anything like it. I thought it must have been a mistake, a faulty batch of ink perhaps. I tried again on a new sheet, using the same content. The same thing happened. The ink vanished, leaving only that one word, hovering ominously on the otherwise blank page. I checked my ink and paper. Everything seemed normal. I even tried a different pen, but the result was always the same. Frustrated, I put the project aside, deciding to look into it the next day. The following morning, I tried again. This time, I switched to a completely different brand of ink, but as I completed the letter, the words faded once more, except for a single word: forget. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was wrong. These letters were not ordinary. I went through each script she had given me, examining the words carefully, but there was nothing unusual about them. Just ordinary messages from a woman to people she once knew. Yet, the ink refused to stay on the page. I contacted her. I needed answers, but the number she gave me was disconnected. Panic set in. I had already been paid a large sum. I couldn't just abandon the commission. I resolved to finish the letters, whatever it took. The third letter was the worst. As soon as I wrote it, the ink evaporated into thin air, leaving behind a single word: die. I couldn't breathe. I stared at that word for hours, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Was this a curse? Some kind of twisted joke? I needed to know what these letters meant. I decided to visit the addresses she had provided. The first one led me to an old house on the outskirts of town. A man, bedridden and weak, lay inside. He was her brother, and he was dying. Cancer, the nurse told me. He didn't have much time left. I hesitated but decided to show him the letter, even though it was blank. His eyes widened in fear, as if he could see the invisible words. He whispered one thing before the machines around him flatlined: remember. I ran out of the house, heart pounding. Something was terribly wrong. I didn't know what to do, but I had to see it through. I needed to finish these letters and understand what they meant. The second address was a small apartment in the city. An elderly woman, her mother, opened the door. She looked at me with hollow eyes as I handed her the blank sheet. She touched it and shuddered. "I've forgotten so much," she murmured, tears welling up in her eyes. "But this, I can't forget this." I backed away slowly, feeling like I was intruding on something I couldn't comprehend. The word echoed in my mind: forget. The third visit was to her ex-husband, a disheveled man living in a run-down trailer park. He didn't say much, just looked at the paper and laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "I guess I'm next," he said, pointing to a shotgun leaning against the wall. I've been thinking about it for a while. I left before he could say more, but I knew I would hear about his death soon. Die. The word was burned into my mind. I couldn't go to the 4th address. I couldn't face another person whose life was somehow tied to these cursed letters. Instead, I went home and stared at the last sheet of paper. It was addressed to herself. What did that mean? Had she known what would happen? Was she warning herself? I had to write it. I picked up my pen, dipped it in ink, and wrote the letter. As I expected, the words disappeared, leaving behind a single one. Life. I slumped back in my chair, exhausted and terrified. What was I supposed to do now? I felt like I was teetering on the edge of some dark revelation, something that would unravel my sanity completely. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about the woman, about her pale face, and the way she had insisted that the words needed to last. I knew I had to find her, but how? The next morning, I received a letter. It was in my handwriting, but I had never written it. My hands shook as I opened the envelope. The words were clear, unchanging. They read, "You have done well, Mr. Parker. The words have taken root, but you must not write anymore, or you too will fade." The letter wasn't signed, but I knew it was from her. The woman who had set me on this path. I knew what I had to do. I had to stop. I had to leave this cursed practice behind. But something compelled me, some dark urge I couldn't resist. I picked up my pen just to see, just to know. As soon as the ink touched the paper, it evaporated, leaving behind a single word. Why? I threw the pen across the room and backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. The words seemed to pulse on the page, as if demanding an answer I couldn't give. Days passed, and I tried to forget, but the words haunted me. I stopped taking commissions, stopped writing altogether. But the letters kept appearing. On my doorstep, in my mailbox, even slipped under my door at night. Each one contained a single word, and they seemed to be telling a story. Gone. Pain. Alone. Return. I knew what they wanted. They wanted me to finish the story, to complete whatever cycle I had unknowingly started. But I couldn't. I was too afraid. Then one night, as I lay in bed, a whisper filled the room. It was her voice, soft and pleading. Please finish it. I got up, my hands trembling, and found the last sheet of parchment. I wrote, not knowing what I was saying, just letting the words flow. As I finished, the ink faded, leaving behind a single word. End. I collapsed, tears streaming down my face. I felt a presence in the room, a shadow moving closer. The whisper came again, but this time it was different. Thank you. And then she was gone. The next morning, I woke up, feeling strangely at peace. The letters had stopped, and the sense of dread that had filled my life for weeks seemed to have lifted. I thought it was over. I thought I was free. But as I sat down at my desk, I saw it, a single word, etched into the wood in dark, unyielding ink. Soon. I don't know what it means. I don't want to know. But I can feel it, something dark and hungry, waiting just beyond the edge of my mind. And I know, deep down, that my story isn't over yet. I've lived in this neighborhood for almost 5 years now. It's the kind of place that makes you feel safe and comfortable, the type where everyone knows each other's names, and life goes on without any major surprises. That is, until recently. There's this one streetlight on the corner of Maple Avenue, just 2 blocks away from my apartment. For the longest time, it was just like any other streetlight, dull and unremarkable, flickering every now and then like they all do. But about 2 weeks ago, I started noticing something strange. Every time I walked past it, the light would flicker more intensely, and then, almost imperceptibly, I'd hear something that sounded like whispering. At first, I thought I was imagining things. I mean, who wouldn't? Streetlights flicker. That's what they do when the bulbs are going out, right? And as for the whispers, well, maybe it was just the wind blowing through the leaves, or the distant hum of the city at night. I brushed it off and kept walking. But it kept happening. Every single time. Whether I was coming back from work late in the evening, or just taking a walk to clear my head, that damn light would start flickering the moment I got close. And then the whispers would begin, faint but clear enough to raise the hairs on the back of my neck. I couldn't make out any words, just a soft murmur that seemed to come from all directions, and nowhere at the same time. The other night, I decided to test it. I went out for a late-night walk specifically to see if it was all just a coincidence. I stood under that streetlight for what must have been 10 minutes. At first, nothing happened. I felt ridiculous standing there, staring up at a streetlight like some crazy person. But then, just as I was about to leave, it happened. The light started flickering, dimming down almost to the point of going out completely, and the whispers returned. This time, they were louder, more insistent, like someone was speaking right into my ear. I whipped around, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was no one. The street was empty, eerily silent except for the low, unintelligible whispers that seemed to come from everywhere. My heart pounded in my chest, and I took a step back. As soon as I moved away from the streetlight, the flickering stopped, and the whispers faded into the night. I rushed home, locking the door behind me, feeling a chill that I couldn't shake off. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that flickering light and heard those whispers. They seemed to echo in my head, as if they were trying to tell me something I couldn't understand. The next day, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the light was faulty, and maybe the whispers were just my imagination running wild because of my lack of sleep. I even considered asking the neighbors if they'd noticed anything strange, but what would I say? Hey, have you heard any spooky whispers under the streetlight at Maple Avenue? Yeah, that would go over well. I decided to ignore it, or at least try to. But it's not that easy when something starts to get under your skin like that. The more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. It was like a splinter in my mind that I couldn't get rid of. So I did what any sane person would do. I went back. It was a Saturday night, and the streets were quiet. I was trembling as I approached the streetlight, not sure if I was more scared of what might happen or of nothing happening at all. I stood there, my eyes glued to the light, my ears straining to catch the whispers. And then, like clockwork, the light flickered, and the whispers began. This time, they were clearer, almost like a chorus of voices overlapping each other. My breath caught in my throat as I realized they were saying something, but I couldn't make out the words. I strained to listen, stepping closer to the pole, my heart racing. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I screamed and spun around, but there was no one there. The street was as empty as before, the only sound the faint hum of the city and the rapid thudding of my own heart. The whispers grew louder, and I could finally make out a single word, repeated over and over again, "Listen." I ran home, not daring to look back. What the hell was going on? I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew something was wrong, something I couldn't explain. The following days were a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. I avoided that streetlight like the plague, taking longer routes to work and avoiding late-night walks altogether. But it was like the light was calling to me, drawing me back to it with an irresistible pull. I had to know. I had to find out what was going on, no matter how terrified I was. So last night, I went back one final time. I stood under the streetlight, my body tense, every nerve on edge. The light flickered, but I didn't flinch. I braced myself as the whispers started, louder than ever before, like a cacophony of voices all speaking at once. I strained to listen, trying to make sense of the noise. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The light went out completely, plunging the street into darkness. I stood there frozen, my breath visible in the cold night air. I was about to turn and run when I heard it, a voice, clear and distinct, coming from right behind me. "Help me." I turned, and there, standing in the shadows, was a figure. It was a woman, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. She looked familiar, but I couldn't place her. She reached out to me, her hand trembling. "Please, you have to help me," she whispered, her voice trembling with desperation. I backed away, my mind racing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. I must be dreaming, or hallucinating, or going completely insane. But she was there, as real as the ground beneath my feet, her eyes pleading with me. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "They're coming," she said, her voice barely a whisper now. "They're coming for me." And then she was gone, like she had never been there at all. The light flickered back on, steady and bright, and the street was empty once more. I stumbled home, my mind a whirl of confusion and fear. Who was she? What did she mean? And why was this happening to me? I don't know what to do. I'm scared, more scared than I'd ever been in my life. But I have to go back. I have to find out the truth, even if it means facing whatever horror is waiting for me under that flickering streetlight. I'm writing this down now, in case something happens to me. If anyone finds this, know that I'm not crazy. There's something wrong with that streetlight, something evil, and I think it wants me. As I made my way back to the streetlight tonight, my heart pounded in my chest. The air felt heavy, thick with the promise of something terrible. I could barely breathe as I approached the corner of Maple Avenue, my eyes locked on the light. It was already flickering as I drew closer, and the whispers were louder than ever. I could hear them clearly now, a chorus of voices all speaking at once, their words blending into a terrifying symphony of despair. I stood under the light, my hands clenched into fists, my body trembling. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty street. The whispers stopped, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, slowly, the light dimmed, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and writhe on the pavement. And then I saw her again, the woman from before, standing just outside the circle of light. She looked even more frightened than before, her eyes wide with terror. "They're here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "They're here, and they won't stop until they have you." I took a step back, my mind racing. "Who are they?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What do they want?" She shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I tried to warn you, but it's too late. They're coming for you now." And then, before I could say anything else, she was gone, disappearing into the darkness like a wisp of smoke. The streetlight flickered wildly, casting strange, twisted shadows all around me. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, a cacophony of voices all screaming my name. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, the whispers following me all the way home. I slammed the door shut behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my body trembling with fear. But I know it's not over. I can feel them, out there in the darkness, waiting for me. They won't stop until they have me, just like they took her. I don't know what they are or what they want, but I know one thing for sure. I'm not going back to that streetlight again. Whatever it is that's waiting for me there, I want no part of it. But deep down, I know it doesn't matter. I can still hear the whispers, even now, faint but unmistakable, calling my name, urging me to come back. I'm scared, more scared than I'd ever been in my life. But I have to face this. I have to find out the truth, no matter the cost. So if you're reading this, know that I tried. I tried to be brave, to face whatever was waiting for me under that flickering streetlight. But I'm not sure if I'm strong enough. I'm going back one last time. I have to know. I have to find out what's been haunting me, what's been calling to me from the darkness. If I don't come back, know that I did my best. And if you ever find yourself walking past a flickering streetlight on a quiet night and you hear whispers calling your name, run. Don't look back. Don't try to understand. Just run. Because some things are better left in the darkness and some truths are too terrible to know. They found my body this morning, lying under that streetlight on Maple Avenue. The cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but I know the truth. They got me. I hope that whoever reads this takes my warning seriously. I'm gone now, but they're still out there, waiting for their next victim. And if you ever find yourself walking past a flickering streetlight and you hear whispers calling your name, remember my story. Remember what happened to me. And run. We found the cellar purely by accident. It was our first week in the new house, a sprawling old place on the edge of town that we bought for a ridiculously low price. The realtor called it a fixer-upper with potential, but I called it a creaky mansion with a leaky roof and more cobwebs than sense. Still, it was ours, and I was excited about making it our home. One evening, while exploring, my son Max stumbled across the cellar door hidden under a dusty old rug in the kitchen. It was like something out of a movie, a trapdoor with a rusty metal ring, almost as if it had been waiting for someone to find it. Max was the one who pulled up the ring first, and as the heavy door creaked open, we were met with a gust of cold, musty air. A set of stone steps descended into darkness. "We should check it out," Max said, his eyes wide with curiosity. My wife, Linda, shook her head. It could be dangerous down there. We don't even know what's in it. I wasn't too sure either, but something about the mystery of it pulled me in. I'll go first, I said, grabbing a flashlight, just to see if it's safe. The stairs groaned under my weight as I descended, shining the light around the small space below. It looked like a normal cellar, stone walls, a dirt floor, shelves covered in dust and old junk. But as I moved the beam across the far wall, I noticed something strange. There were no other doors, no windows, no exits at all except the one I came through. "There's not much here," I called up, trying to sound casual, even though a knot of unease was forming in my stomach. Just some old shelves and stuff, probably just a storage space. We closed the door and thought nothing of it, but that was only the beginning. A few days later, Max and I decided to clean out the cellar. We brought down boxes to store some of the junk we didn't need upstairs. As soon as I stepped down into the cellar, something felt different. The air was colder and the space seemed bigger. "Did it feel this big last time?" Max asked, echoing my thoughts. "No, it didn't," I replied, shining the flashlight around. The walls seemed farther apart, the ceiling higher, and there was something else. A door that wasn't there before, on the far wall, almost hidden in the shadows. "Was that door there before?" Max asked, his voice a whisper. I shook my head, my mouth dry. No, it wasn't. Without thinking, I walked over and tried the handle. It was stiff but turned with a bit of force. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow corridor lined with more shelves, filled with old books and jars of unidentifiable contents. The floor was dusty, with a few scattered footprints that definitely didn't belong to us. "Dad, I don't think we should go in there," Max said, his hand on my arm. He was right, of course. Every logical part of me screamed to back away, to close the door and forget we ever saw it. But something else, a kind of morbid curiosity, pushed me forward. "Just a quick look," I muttered, stepping inside. The corridor twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the darkness. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. I kept expecting it to lead us back to the cellar like a loop, but it didn't. Instead, it ended in another room, even larger than the cellar itself. "What is this place?" Max whispered, his voice echoing in the vast emptiness. "I have no idea," I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. We didn't stay long. The unease was too great, and as we hurried back to the cellar, I felt like we were being watched, though I didn't dare turn around. We made it back to the cellar door and slammed it shut, breathing heavily. "We're not going back down there," I said, and Max nodded in agreement. But the cellar had other plans. Linda noticed the change in me over the next few days. I was restless, distracted. Every time I passed the cellar door, I felt a pull, like it was calling to me. Max, too, was uneasy, avoiding the kitchen altogether. "Why don't we just seal it up?" Linda suggested one evening after I told her about the corridor. "If it's making you uncomfortable, just nail it shut." It sounded like a good idea, and I almost did it, but something stopped me. A nagging thought that we hadn't seen everything down there, that there was more to discover. One night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of something creaking downstairs. I grabbed a flashlight and crept down, my heart in my throat. The cellar door was open, just a crack, a sliver of darkness visible through the gap. I should have closed it and gone back to bed. Instead, I grabbed the flashlight and opened it wider. The cold air hit me like a slap, and I saw that the cellar had changed again. The shelves were gone, replaced by walls lined with pictures. Old, black and white photographs of people I didn't recognize, their eyes staring blankly at the camera and somehow at me. I slammed the door shut and ran back upstairs, my hands shaking. Linda woke up and asked what was wrong, but I couldn't find the words to explain. Over the next few weeks, the cellar consumed my thoughts. I started spending more time down there, exploring the ever-changing rooms and corridors. Every time I went down, the layout was different. Sometimes it was a maze of narrow passages. Other times, it opened into vast empty halls with ceilings so high I couldn't see them in the flashlight's beam. I found more doors too. Some led to rooms filled with strange artifacts, others to places that seemed to defy logic. A staircase spiraling down into darkness, a well with no bottom, a room with walls covered in writing I couldn't understand. Max begged me to stop going down there. "It's not safe, Dad. It's changing you." but I couldn't stop. The cellar was like a drug, pulling me in deeper every time. I started seeing things, shadows flitting just out of sight, whispers that faded when I tried to listen. I didn't tell Linda or Max. They were already scared enough. It was a rainy night when things finally came to a head. I was sitting in the living room, staring at the cellar door when I heard it, a faint tapping, like someone knocking on the inside. My heart froze, but I felt compelled to answer it. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door. The layout had changed again. This time, there was a narrow passage that led to a single door at the end. A door that looked newer than the others, almost out of place. The knocking grew louder as I approached. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, and when I turned it, the door swung open with a rush of cold air. Inside was a small, dark room with a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, flickering weakly. In the center of the room was a figure, a man, hunched over, his back to me. His clothes were tattered, his hair long and matted. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The man slowly turned around, and I took a step back in horror. His face was twisted, his eyes empty sockets, his mouth stretched in a grotesque grin. "I've been waiting for you," he whispered, his voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, and turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me. The light bulb flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I don't know how long I was down there, trapped in that room with the man. It felt like hours, days, even. His whispers filled the darkness, telling me things I didn't want to hear. Things about the house, about the cellar, about the others who had come before us and never left. When I finally woke up, I was lying on the cellar floor, the door to the room gone, the walls back to their normal stone and dirt. I stumbled upstairs, my body aching, my mind a blur. Linda and Max were waiting for me, their faces pale with fear. "What happened?" Linda asked, her voice shaking. "You were gone for 2 days." I didn't have an answer. We should have left the house then and there. We should have packed our bags and never looked back, but we didn't. Something kept us there, a twisted sense of curiosity, a need to understand what was happening. That was our mistake. A week later, Max disappeared. One moment he was in his room, and the next he was gone, his window open, the curtains blowing in the wind. We searched the house, the yard, the neighborhood, but there was no sign of him. And then I heard it, the sound of his voice, faint and distant, coming from the cellar. I ran down, flashlight in hand, my heart pounding. The cellar had changed again, the walls shifting and twisting as I moved through the maze of corridors. I followed his voice, growing fainter with each step, until I reached a door I had never seen before. I opened it, and there he was, standing in the center of a room with walls covered in pictures. Pictures of us, of our family, of the house. His eyes were wide, his face pale, his lips moving silently. "Max." I called out, but he didn't respond. He just stared at me, his eyes empty, his expression blank. And then he turned and walked into the wall, disappearing as if he had never been there at all. I screamed his name, pounding on the wall, but it was solid stone. I collapsed to the floor, sobbing, the flashlight flickering in my hand. I don't remember how I got out of the cellar. The next thing I knew, I was outside, standing in the yard, the house looming behind me. Linda was gone too. I don't know where she went, and I'm too afraid to go back inside and find out. I'm writing this now from a hotel room, my hands shaking, my mind barely holding on to sanity. I don't know what's happening, what that cellar is, or why it's doing this to us. All I know is that it's not over. I can still hear them, Linda and Max, calling to me from the darkness, begging me to come back. But I won't. I can't. I've boarded up the house, left it to rot. I won't go back. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it, the sound of that cellar door creaking open, the faint whispers drifting through the wind. I know it's waiting for me. I know it will never let us go. I was on call that night, tired and counting down the minutes until my shift ended. The hospital was eerily quiet, just the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional beat from the monitors in the background. Most of the staff had gone home, and only a few of us remained in the emergency department. I was sipping on a cold cup of coffee when the phone rang, breaking the silence. "Dr. Hayes, we have a situation in the ER." The nurse's voice crackled through the line. "You might want to see this." With a sigh, I put down my cup and headed to the ER. My mind was already racing through the possibilities. Another overdose, a car accident, or maybe just someone with a bad case of the flu. But nothing could have prepared me for what I saw when I walked through those doors. There, on the gurney, was a man who looked pale as a ghost. His skin was almost translucent, his eyes sunken in as if he hadn't slept in years. He stared blankly at the ceiling, his chest barely moving with each shallow breath. "Who is he?" I asked, glancing at the nurse. No ID, no wallet, nothing. He was found wandering outside, claiming he's dead. Dead. I raised an eyebrow. And he walked in here on his own? The nurse shrugged. He's been insisting that he's dead for the past hour, and now his vitals are strange. I picked up his chart and looked at the readings. His heart rate was erratic, dropping dangerously low and then spiking back up. Blood pressure all over the place. It didn't make any sense. "What's your name?" I asked, leaning over him. His eyes shifted to me, and he opened his mouth slowly. "James," he whispered, his voice hollow and distant. "James, do you know where you are?" "I'm dead," he murmured. "I shouldn't be here." I exchanged a glance with the nurse. We'd seen our fair share of strange cases, but this was something else. I decided to admit him for observation, curious and uneasy about what we were dealing with. James didn't talk much after that. We put him in a private room, hooked him up to monitors, and I instructed the staff to keep a close eye on him. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that there was more to his story than he was letting on. Around 3 a.m., the alarms went off. I rushed to his room, my heart pounding. The monitor showed a flat line. "Code blue." I yelled, and the team scrambled into action. We started chest compressions, administered medication, did everything by the book. After a few tense moments, his heart started beating again, slow and steady. I leaned against the wall, catching my breath. What the hell just happened? "He was dead," Dr. Hayes, one of the nurses said, her voice shaking. I swear he was gone. I looked at James. His eyes were open, staring right at me. There was something unnerving in his gaze, something that made my skin crawl. "You're back, James," I said cautiously. "Do you remember what happened?" He nodded slowly. "I told you, I'm dead." "Your heart stopped. You were clinically dead for 2 minutes." "I know," he whispered. "It's not the first time." The room fell silent. We all exchanged uneasy glances. I'd seen people come back from the brink before, but this was different. There was no fear in his eyes, no relief, just a cold, hollow acceptance. "Keep him under observation," I instructed. "I'll be in my office." I walked out, feeling a chill run down my spine. There was something deeply unsettling about James, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The next morning, I went to check on James again. He was sitting up in bed, looking out the window. He turned his head slowly as I entered. "Good morning," I said, trying to sound cheerful. "How are you feeling?" "Like I don't belong here," he replied. I sat down beside him. "James, I need you to tell me what's going on. Why do you keep saying you're dead?" He was silent for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "I died 3 months ago," he said finally. "I remember everything. The darkness, the emptiness, and then I was back. But I wasn't supposed to be." "Back from where?" "From the other side," he whispered, his eyes locking onto mine. "They sent me back. I don't know why, but every now and then my body remembers. It stops, and I'm gone. Just like that." I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of elaborate delusion, but the way he spoke, the certainty in his voice, it made me question everything I knew. "Have you seen anyone about this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He shook his head. "They wouldn't believe me. They'd think I was crazy." "What about your family? Friends?" "I don't have anyone," he said quietly. "Not anymore." I took a deep breath. "James, we're going to run some more tests. I need to understand what's happening to you." He just nodded, his expression vacant. "It won't help. You can't stop it." That night, I stayed in the hospital, too restless to go home. I couldn't get James's words out of my head. I kept going over his file, looking for something, anything that could explain what was happening. But there was nothing. No medical history, no records, just a ghost of a man who claimed to be dead. I must have dozed off in my office because I woke up to the sound of alarms blaring. My heart raced as I bolted out of my chair and ran to James's room. The scene inside was pure chaos. Nurses and doctors were crowded around his bed, frantically trying to resuscitate him. The monitor showed a flat line again. "Not again," I muttered, pushing my way through. We worked on him for what felt like hours, but nothing was working. His heart wasn't responding, his body lifeless. Just as I was about to call it, to declare him dead, his eyes snapped open. Everyone froze. James sat up slowly, looking around the room, his face calm and composed. "I told you," he said softly. "I'm already dead." I took a step back, my mind reeling. This was impossible. It defied everything I knew, everything I'd been taught. "How did you?" I stammered, but the words wouldn't come out. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood up. "It's time for me to go." "No, you need to stay here," I said, reaching out to stop him. But he just looked at me, and there was something in his eyes that made me freeze. "You can't keep me here," he said gently. "This isn't my place anymore." I watched, helpless, as he walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the empty hallway. I wanted to follow, to stop him, but I couldn't move. It was like I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by some invisible force. We searched the hospital, but James was nowhere to be found. It was like he had vanished into thin air. Security footage showed him walking out the front door, but after that, nothing. No trace, no sign of where he'd gone. I tried to forget about it, to convince myself that it was just a bizarre case, that there was some rational explanation. But I knew better. There was something about James, something beyond my understanding. A few days later, I got a call from the morgue. My heart sank as I listened to the voice on the other end. "Dr. Hayes, you might want to come down here. We have a body that matches your description of the missing patient." I drove to the morgue, my hands shaking. The coroner led me to a cold, sterile room and pulled back the sheet. It was James. I stared at his lifeless face, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. He looked peaceful, almost serene. I checked the tag on his toe. Date of death: 3 days ago, the same night he disappeared from the hospital. "This can't be right," I muttered. I saw him leave. The coroner gave me a puzzled look. "Well, according to this, he's been dead for 3 days. Found in an alley downtown, no signs of foul play." I felt a shiver run down my spine. This was impossible, and yet, there he was, cold and lifeless on the table. I left the morgue in a daze, my mind racing. What had I been dealing with? Who, or what, was James? I couldn't let it go. I started digging into his past, trying to find anything that could explain what had happened. It took weeks, but I finally found something. James had died 3 months ago, just like he said. A car accident. He'd been pronounced dead on the scene. I stared at the article, my heart pounding. This wasn't possible. I went back to the hospital records, looking for any clue, any sign that could help me understand. And then I found it, buried deep in the system, a report of a body going missing from the morgue 3 months ago. James's body. I sat back in my chair, my mind reeling. He had died, and somehow he'd come back. But why? And for what purpose? And then I remembered his words. They sent me back. But who were they? I never found out what happened to James, or why he'd been sent back. But every now and then, I think about him. About the way his heart stopped, about the look in his eyes, and I can't shake the feeling that there's more to this world than we can ever understand. A few weeks ago, I got a call from another hospital across town. They had a patient, a man who claimed to be dead. His heart kept stopping during surgery, and no one could explain why. I hung up the phone, my hands trembling. I knew I couldn't get involved again. Whatever this was, it was beyond me, beyond anything I could comprehend. But sometimes, late at night, when the hospital is quiet and the shadows seem to move on their own, I wonder. I wonder if James is out there somewhere, still wandering, still searching for a place to belong. And I wonder if one day I'll see him again. Because in the end, we're all just waiting for the darkness to take us. Some of us just take a little longer to get there. I moved into the house on Willow Street last winter, right after my divorce. It was a fixer-upper, but I needed a change, something to occupy my mind and hands. I figured I could handle a bit of renovation work. It would keep me busy, and the place had a certain charm despite its age. It had this creaky wooden staircase, a big old oak tree in the front yard, and a basement that stretched under the whole house, a rare find in this neighborhood. I bought it on a whim, but from the first night, I knew something wasn't quite right. It was subtle at first. I'd be down in the basement, organizing old boxes or checking the fuse box, and I'd hear this faint sound. Like a distant conversation, just low enough that I couldn't make out the words. I chalked it up to the house settling, or maybe some pipes running through the walls. Houses make noises, right? The whispers became more persistent as the days passed. It was like they were calling to me, though I couldn't understand a word. It's hard to explain, but the feeling they gave me wasn't fear, at least not at first. It was more of a strange curiosity, like I was overhearing something that wasn't meant for me. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was just my imagination, but that didn't last long. One evening, I was sitting in the living room, flipping through an old photo album I'd found in the attic. It was filled with pictures of the previous owners, a family of 4. There was something unsettling about the way they smiled, like they were hiding a secret. I tried to shake off the feeling, but then I heard it again, the whispers. This time, they were louder, clearer. I dropped the album and headed down to the basement, almost without thinking. The moment I opened the door, the air changed. It felt heavier, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The sound was coming from the far corner, near the old wine rack. I moved closer, and for the first time, I thought I caught a word. It was so faint, so fleeting, but I swear it was my name. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel sweat forming on my forehead. It wasn't possible. There was no one else in the house. I stood there for what felt like hours, just listening. The whispers faded, leaving me in silence. I told myself it was stress, the remnants of a failed marriage, too much caffeine, and too little sleep. But deep down, I knew it was something else. I started avoiding the basement after that. I told myself I didn't need to go down there, that it was just a creepy, dark place filled with old junk. But every time I walked past the door, I could feel something pulling at me, urging me to come back down. It was like the basement was alive, waiting for me. A week passed before I went down again. It was late, and I'd had a few beers. I guess I needed some liquid courage. The whispers greeted me as soon as I opened the door. They were softer this time, almost welcoming. I walked down the steps, my legs shaky but determined. I stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by shadows, and listened. The voices were clearer now, a jumble of words and phrases I couldn't make sense of. But then, one voice stood out among the rest. It was a woman's voice, soft and sad. "Help me," she said. I felt a chill run down my spine. I wanted to run back upstairs, to get out of that house and never look back. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear and curiosity. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. There was no answer, just the murmur of voices blending together. I waited, my heart in my throat, but the whispers eventually faded into silence. I stumbled back up the stairs, my mind racing. I tried to sleep that night, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard her voice. "Help me." I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was down there, something that needed me. Or maybe it was just messing with my head. Either way, I had to find out. I had to know what those whispers were, who the woman was, and what she wanted from me. I started spending more time in the basement, trying to communicate with whatever was down there. I'd sit on an old wooden stool, the air around me cold and thick, and ask questions. Sometimes I'd get a response, a word or two that didn't make sense. Other times, it was just that woman's voice, pleading for help. I did some research on the house, but there wasn't much to find. The previous owners, the Thompsons, had lived here for nearly 30 years before moving out. There were no reports of anything unusual, no history of hauntings or tragic events, just a regular family in a regular house. But the whispers told a different story. They spoke of secrets, of hidden things buried deep in the ground. I began to feel like I was losing my mind, spending all my free time in that dark, cold basement, listening to voices no one else could hear. I stopped inviting friends over, stopped going out. The whispers became my obsession. One night, I decided to record them. I set up my phone on the workbench and hit record, then sat down to wait. The voices came almost immediately, soft and insistent. I couldn't understand most of it, but I knew they were talking to me. I felt a strange sense of connection, like I was a part of something bigger than myself. After a few minutes, I stopped the recording and played it back. My heart sank. There was nothing there, just silence. No whispers, no voices, nothing. I replayed it over and over, but the result was the same. I was the only one who could hear them. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, staring at the basement door, wondering if I was losing my mind. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. The whispers were real. They had to be. The next few days bled together. I barely left the house, my thoughts consumed by those whispers. I tried everything to record them again, different devices, different times of day, but the results were always the same. Silence. I started feeling like a prisoner in my own home, chained to that basement door, waiting for something I couldn't explain. One evening, after a long day of fruitless attempts, I decided to confront the whispers head-on. I grabbed a flashlight and headed downstairs. The basement was colder than usual, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. I walked over to the far corner, where the whispers were usually the strongest, and sat down on an old chair. I took a deep breath and spoke. "I'm here. What do you want from me?" At first, there was nothing. Just the hum of the furnace and the creak of the house settling above me. I was about to give up when I heard it again. Her voice, the same soft, pleading tone I'd heard before. "Help me." I shivered, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. How can I help you?" There was a pause, and then a series of whispers, too fast and garbled for me to understand. I closed my eyes, trying to focus, but it was like listening to 100 conversations at once. Then, out of the chaos, her voice rose again, clearer this time. "Find me." "Find you? Where?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Where are you?" The whispers swirled around me, and then they were gone, leaving only her voice behind. "Underneath." I frowned, my mind racing. Underneath? Underneath what? The house? The basement? I stood up, the flashlight beam sweeping across the concrete floor. I felt stupid, like I was chasing shadows, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was close to something important. I started knocking on the walls, the floor, listening for any hollow sound. I must have looked like a madman, crawling around on my hands and knees, but I didn't care. I was desperate for answers, for anything that made sense. And then, near the far wall, I found it. A small section of the floor that sounded different, hollow. My heart raced as I grabbed a hammer and started chipping away at the concrete. It took hours, and by the time I'd made a hole big enough to see through, my hands were blistered and bleeding. I shined the flashlight into the hole and nearly dropped it. There was a space down there, a crawl space that ran under the entire basement. And in the corner, just visible in the beam of light, was something that made my blood run cold. It was a hand. I jumped back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I must have stood there for a long time, staring at that hole, my mind refusing to believe what I'd seen. But I couldn't ignore it. I had to know. I grabbed the flashlight and crawled through the hole, my body trembling with fear. The crawl space was tight, the ceiling barely a foot above me. The air was thick and musty, and every breath tasted like dirt. I moved slowly, the flashlight beam flickering as I inched closer to the hand. It was pale and skeletal, reaching out as if begging for help. I felt bile rise in my throat, but I forced myself to keep going. I shined the light further down and saw what I'd been dreading. There was a body, half buried in the dirt. It was a woman, or what was left of one. Her clothes were tattered, her face gaunt and hollow. But even in death, her eyes seemed to be staring right at me, pleading. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. This was her, the woman from the whispers. She'd been buried down here, alone in the dark, for who knows how long. I had to call the police, had to get out of this nightmare. But as I turned to leave, I felt something cold wrap around my ankle. I screamed, dropping the flashlight. I tried to kick free, but the grip was like iron. I looked down and saw her hand, impossibly strong, pulling me closer. The whispers were back, louder now, filling the crawl space with a deafening roar. I clawed at the dirt, desperate to escape, but it was no use. "Help me," she whispered, her voice inside my head, echoing through every part of me. I don't know how long I fought, but eventually the darkness took over. I woke up in the basement, covered in dirt and sweat. The hole in the floor was gone, replaced with a smooth layer of concrete. My hands were clean, my clothes untouched, as if nothing had happened. But I knew it wasn't a dream. I could still feel her touch, still hear her voice. I stumbled upstairs, my mind blank with fear. I needed to get out, to leave this house and never come back. But as I reached the front door, I heard it again. Her voice, soft and pleading, coming from the basement. "Help me." I froze, my hand on the doorknob. I wanted to leave, to run as far away as I could. But I couldn't move. Her voice held me there, pulling me back, pulling me down. I turned around, my body moving on its own, and walked back to the basement. The whispers surrounded me as I descended the stairs, a chorus of voices urging me forward. I reached the bottom and saw the hole was back, the concrete shattered like it had never been fixed. I fell to my knees, my heart pounding in my chest, and crawled back into the crawl space. She was waiting for me, her eyes dark and empty, her hand outstretched. I felt myself reaching out, my fingers trembling as they brushed against hers. The whispers grew louder, deafening, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the basement floor. The whispers were gone, the house silent. I tried to stand, but my body wouldn't respond. Panic surged through me as I realized I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was trapped, a prisoner in my own body. And then I saw her. The woman, standing in the corner, her eyes locked on mine. She smiled, a cold, lifeless smile, and I knew what had happened. She had taken my body, left me down here, trapped in the darkness, just like she had been. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was helpless, watching as she turned and walked up the stairs, leaving me behind. I could hear her voice, soft and mocking, as she left the basement. "Thank you," she whispered. And then the door closed, and I was alone, surrounded by the silence and the dark. Flying has been my life for the past 15 years. I've been a commercial airline pilot, soaring through the skies and crisscrossing the world. It's a job that comes with a lot of responsibility and sometimes long hours of isolation. But I've never minded it. There's something soothing about the hum of the engines and the endless expanse of clouds below. That is, until recently. Something has changed on my usual route, and I can't seem to shake off this strange feeling that there's more to it than what meets the eye. It all started 3 months ago. I was assigned to fly a route from Seattle to Anchorage, one I've flown countless times before. The flight was smooth, nothing unusual. It was a red-eye, so the passengers were mostly asleep, the cabin dimly lit. I was doing my usual checks, running through the numbers, when I glanced over at the passenger list on my tablet. I don't normally pay much attention to the individual names, but one caught my eye. David Harker, seat 12A. I don't know why it stuck with me. Maybe it was because it was the only name listed in that entire row, which is rare on a nearly full flight. I brushed it off and continued with my routine. Everything went as planned, and I thought nothing more of it. A week later, I flew the same route again. I was doing my pre-flight checks, and as I scrolled through the passenger list, there it was again. David Harker, seat 12A. My first thought was that he must be a frequent flyer. But when I asked the flight attendants about him, they all gave me puzzled looks. "We don't have a David Harker on board," one of them said, checking her own list. I was sure I'd seen his name, but I didn't push it. It's not unusual for the lists to update at the last minute, and maybe he had cancelled his ticket. Still, I couldn't shake off the strange feeling that something wasn't right. The next time I flew that route, I made a point of checking the list again. And there it was. David Harker, seat 12A. I checked with the flight attendant as discreetly as I could. "Can you check if someone's sitting in seat 12A? I asked. She looked at me, confused, but went to check anyway. A few moments later, she returned, her face pale. "Captain, there's no one in that seat," she said. But what?" "It's reserved," she whispered, glancing around as if she didn't want anyone to overhear. "Every time we fly this route, it's marked as reserved, but nobody ever sits there." I felt a chill run down my spine. This was more than just a clerical error. I decided to take a look for myself. I put the plane on autopilot and walked back to the cabin. The lights were dim, and most of the passengers were asleep. I made my way to row 12, my heart pounding in my chest. And there he was. A man, probably in his early 40s, sitting in 12A. He looked out the window, his face pale and expressionless. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't expected to actually see someone there. He didn't look up as I approached, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do, before I slowly backed away and returned to the cockpit. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. I didn't even know how to describe it. Maybe I was just tired, I told myself. But the image of that man, sitting there silently, wouldn't leave my mind. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every time I flew that route, I checked the passenger list. Every time there he was, David Harker, seat 12A, and every time I saw him sitting there, staring out the window. I started asking around discreetly, trying to find out more about him. Nobody seemed to know anything. He wasn't a registered frequent flyer, and there were no records of his bookings. It was like he didn't exist. I became obsessed. I started flying the route more often, taking on extra shifts just to see if he would be there. And he always was. Always in seat 12A, always staring out the window. It was like he was waiting for something or someone. I started to notice other strange things. The air in the cabin around row 12 was always colder, like there was a draft that no one else could feel. The lights flickered occasionally, just in that part of the plane, and the passengers around him seemed to avoid looking at the seat, as if they knew something was off but didn't want to acknowledge it. One night, I decided to confront him. It was a stupid idea, but I was at my wit's end. I waited until most of the passengers were asleep and the cabin was quiet. I left the cockpit and made my way to row 12. My hands were shaking, but I was determined to get some answers. "Excuse me, sir," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't move, didn't even blink. I reached out and touched his shoulder, and that's when everything changed. The moment my hand made contact, the cabin lights flickered, and the plane shuddered violently. It was like we hit a pocket of turbulence, but there was no warning, no reason for it. I staggered back, and he turned to look at me. His eyes were hollow, empty. There was no life in them, just an endless dark void. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, a cold, piercing wind seemed to flow from him, chilling me to the bone. I stumbled back, terrified. I ran back to the cockpit and shut the door behind me, my heart racing. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I knew it wasn't normal. I didn't say anything to my co-pilot. I couldn't. I just sat there, shaking, until we finally landed in Anchorage. After that, I avoided flying that route. I made up excuses, switched schedules with other pilots, anything to keep from seeing that man again. But the airline was short-staffed, and eventually I had no choice. It was a few weeks later, and I was scheduled for the Seattle-Anchorage route again. My hands were trembling as I did the pre-flight checks. I was almost too afraid to look at the passenger list, but I couldn't help myself. And there it was, David Harker, seat 12A. This time, I decided I needed to know more. I did some digging, looking into past passenger records. It wasn't easy, but eventually, I found something that made my blood run cold. David Harker had died 3 years ago on this very route. He'd suffered a heart attack mid-flight and passed away in seat 12A. Since then, that seat had always been marked as reserved, but no one had ever seen him on board. No one except me. I didn't know what to do. I considered quitting, transferring to another route, anything to get away from this nightmare. But something kept drawing me back. I had to know why he was there, what he wanted. The next time I flew that route, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront him, but I would try to communicate. I brought a small notepad with me and wrote a simple message, "What do you want?" During the flight, I left the note on the seat next to him while he was staring out the window. I didn't stick around to see what happened, just placed it there and walked away. When I checked later, the note was gone. In its place was a single word, scrawled in messy handwriting, "Help." I didn't know what to think. How could I help someone who was already dead? I didn't know what he needed, what he wanted, but I knew I had to try. I started researching everything I could about David Harker. He'd been a businessman, traveling for work, when he died. There were no family members, no friends who'd come forward. It was like he'd just vanished from the world, forgotten by everyone. I felt a strange connection to him, like I was the only one who could give him the closure he needed. I started leaving notes for him on every flight, asking questions, trying to understand. Sometimes he would write back short, cryptic messages that didn't make much sense. But one thing was clear, he was trapped, and he needed my help to move on. I tried everything I could think of. I reached out to his old company, spoke to people who had known him, but nobody had any answers. It was like he'd been erased from their memories. The last time I flew that route, I was desperate. I wrote one final note, begging him to tell me how I could help. I left it on the seat, then returned to the cockpit, my heart heavy with dread. When I checked back, the note was gone. In its place was a single line, "Let me go." I didn't know what he meant, but I had a sinking feeling that he wanted me to do something I wasn't prepared for. I thought about canceling the flight, about refusing to go back up there, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. He would always be there waiting. I flew the route one last time, knowing it would be my final flight. I didn't leave a note this time. I just sat there, staring at the empty seat, waiting for something to happen. And then it did. The plane shuddered and the lights flickered. The passengers were asleep, oblivious, but I felt it. A presence, cold and heavy, filled the cabin. I turned, and there he was, standing in the aisle, looking at me. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with those hollow eyes. I knew what he wanted, and I knew I had to give it to him. I don't remember much of what happened next. I just remember the plane shaking, the lights flickering, and then darkness. When I woke up, we were on the ground. The passengers were confused, but safe. I don't know how I managed to land the plane, but I knew it wasn't me, it was him. I quit the airline after that. I couldn't fly anymore, couldn't face the thought of seeing him again. But I think I helped him. I think he's gone now, wherever he needed to go. I don't know if anyone will believe this story. I barely believe it myself. But every time I close my eyes, I see his face, those empty eyes staring back at me. I don't know what I did, but I hope I made the right choice. I haven't flown since then. I've tried to move on, but the memory of that night haunts me. I still wake up sometimes, thinking I'm back in the cockpit, feeling that cold wind on my skin. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I can still hear his voice, whispering that single word over and over again, "Help." I don't know if I'll ever find peace, but I hope wherever he is, David Harker has found his, because I know I never will. We moved into the house with high hopes. It was one of those old Victorian homes that had character, creaky wooden floors, intricate moldings, and a cozy charm that modern homes just couldn't replicate. My wife, Emma, had fallen in love with it the moment she saw the pictures online, and I must admit, I had too. Our kids, Lily and Ben, were excited about having a big backyard to play in. Everything seemed perfect, like a fresh start for our little family. But you know what they say about things that seem too good to be true. It was on our second day, while we were unpacking, that I found the drawings. They were hidden away in the attic, stacked neatly in an old, dusty trunk. At first, I thought they were just some kids' doodles left behind by the previous owners. Each sheet was covered in strange, almost childlike drawings. But there was something off about them. Each drawing depicted scenes from different rooms in the house, our house, but they looked slightly different from what they were now. I called Emma over to take a look. Maybe they were planning some renovations. She suggested, squinting at one of the drawings that showed our living room, with the furniture arranged differently. Maybe, I said, but I wasn't convinced. It just felt weird. We brushed it off as a quirky find and went back to unpacking. But that was only the beginning. It happened 2 days later. Emma had gone out to run some errands, and I was home with the kids, trying to make the place feel a little more lived in. Lily and Ben were in their room, playing with their toys. I was in the living room, arranging some books on the shelf, when I saw it. The drawing from the attic. It was lying on the coffee table, even though I was sure we had left all the drawings in the attic. I picked it up, and my heart dropped. It showed a picture of our living room, exactly how it looked now, with the books scattered around and a broken vase on the floor. I glanced around the room, no broken vase. But as if on cue, I heard a crash from behind me. I spun around to see Ben standing by the bookshelf, his eyes wide, looking down at the pieces of the vase he'd just knocked over. "Sorry, Dad, it was an accident," he stammered, looking terrified. I assured him it was okay and cleaned up the mess, but my mind was racing. The drawing had shown this. I was sure of it. I even ran upstairs to the attic to check the other drawings, but they were all still there, untouched. I decided not to tell Emma about it. I mean, how could I explain it without sounding crazy? As the days passed, more drawings appeared around the house. Sometimes I'd find them under the kids' pillows, other times taped to the fridge. Each one depicted something that hadn't happened yet but soon would. One morning, I found a drawing of our backyard, with Lily standing next to the old oak tree. Above her was a large branch, cracked and about to fall. I immediately rushed outside and found Lily playing in the exact spot. I called her over, and as soon as she stepped away, the branch snapped and crashed to the ground. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was like someone or something was trying to warn us. But who or what? Emma noticed my growing anxiety but didn't push me to talk about it. I think she sensed that whatever was bothering me, I wasn't ready to share. I was caught between wanting to protect my family and not wanting to scare them. One evening, a man came to our door. He looked disheveled, like he hadn't slept in days, and his eyes darted around nervously. He introduced himself as Mr. Donovan, the previous owner of the house. "I need to talk to you about the drawings," he said, his voice low and urgent. I felt a chill run down my spine. I invited him in, and we sat down in the kitchen. He refused the coffee I offered and went straight to the point. "Did you find them? The drawings?" he asked. I nodded, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. "You have to get rid of them," he said, his voice shaking. "They cursed. They showed you what's going to happen, but not just to warn you. They want you to know you can't change it." "What do you mean?" I asked, my mouth dry. Mr. Donovan took a deep breath. "They showed me things. Terrible things. My wife, she didn't believe me until it was too late. You have to leave this house. Destroy the drawings and never look back." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to believe he was just some crazy old man, but deep down, I knew he was telling the truth. Before he left, he handed me an envelope. "I hope you'll never need this," he said, and then he was gone. I opened the envelope that night. Inside was a letter detailing everything Mr. Donovan had gone through in the house. The drawings had shown him accidents, deaths, things that couldn't be prevented no matter how hard he tried. It drove his wife mad, and she ended up taking her own life. He left the house, hoping to leave the curse behind, but it didn't work. The drawings kept appearing, haunting him. I felt a cold dread settling in my bones. I couldn't let this happen to my family. I gathered all the drawings and threw them into the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed them. But the next morning, they were back, neatly stacked on the coffee table. Emma found me staring at them, my hands shaking. She looked at me with a mixture of fear and concern. "We need to leave," I whispered, but she shook her head. "We can't just run away. Maybe we should talk to someone, get help." But what help could we get against something like this? It was the night before we planned to leave. I found the last drawing in our bedroom. It showed our family, all of us, lying in our beds. Above each of our heads was a shadowy figure, something dark and twisted, hovering, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, watching the shadows move outside, my heart pounding in my chest. Emma tried to comfort me, but I could see the fear in her eyes too. Around midnight, I heard a noise from the kids' room. I rushed in and found Lily and Ben standing by their beds, staring at a drawing pinned to the wall. It showed the two of them, standing exactly where they were now, but behind them was someone, standing in the doorway. I turned around, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing there. I grabbed them and ran to our room, locking the door behind us. We sat there, huddled together, until the first light of dawn crept through the windows. We were leaving, no matter what. But the house had other plans. We were packed and ready to go by sunrise. I had the kids in the car, and Emma was locking up the house. I turned the key in the ignition, but the car wouldn't start. I tried again, but it was dead. My hands were shaking as I turned to Emma, who was standing outside the car, her face pale. "They're not going to let us leave," she whispered, and I knew she was right. The front door of the house creaked open, and I felt a cold wind brush against my skin. I looked at Emma, and she nodded. We had no choice but to go back inside. The house felt different, darker, as if it were alive. We walked through the hallway, and I saw the drawings on the walls, hundreds of them, each showing us, our family, in different scenes. Some were mundane, others terrifying, but all of them had one thing in common. We were trapped inside the house. In the living room, the fireplace roared to life, and there, in the flames, was the final drawing. It showed the house burning with us inside, and outside, the dark figures watched, their hollow eyes glowing in the darkness. Emma screamed, and I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned, but there was no one there. The walls seemed to close in around us, the air thick with smoke. I grabbed the kids, trying to shield them, but it was no use. The house had us. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was a drawing of my family, our faces twisted in fear as the shadows closed in. And then nothing. The house stood silent and empty, the windows dark. The for sale sign on the lawn swayed in the breeze. Inside, the drawings lay scattered on the floor waiting. A young couple walked up the driveway, holding hands, their eyes full of hope. They had no idea what awaited them inside. But they would soon find out. The house always found a way to make its presence known. It was just a matter of time. I wasn't expecting any packages that day. When the doorbell rang, I thought it was probably one of my neighbors asking for a favor again. I dragged myself from the couch, where I was comfortably nestled with a book, and went to answer it. A small, nondescript box sat on the doorstep. There was no return address, just my name scrawled in neat handwriting on the front. I looked around, but no one was in sight. Curious, I picked it up and brought it inside. The box was surprisingly light. I set it on the kitchen table and went to grab a pair of scissors. As I cut through the tape and opened it, I found another box inside. This one was wooden, with a small, intricate lock on the front. It looked old, like something you'd find in an antique shop. There was no note, no explanation, just the box and its lock. I turned it over in my hands, looking for any clues about who might have sent it or why. But there was nothing. It was just a locked box. I gave it a little shake, but there was no sound, nothing to indicate what might be inside. That's when I noticed something else. The air around the box felt colder, like a tiny draft was leaking from it. I frowned and put it down. Maybe I was just imagining things. I decided not to think too much about it. I set the box on the mantel in the living room and went back to my book, but the thought of the strange delivery lingered in my mind. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, my mind drifting back to that locked box. Who would send me something like that, and why? I got up to get some water and passed by the living room on the way to the kitchen. That's when I heard it, soft, almost inaudible, but definitely there. A scratching sound like tiny claws against wood. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The noise was coming from the box. I shook my head, trying to convince myself I was just hearing things. Maybe it was just the house settling, or a branch scraping against the window outside. But as I stood there, listening, the scratching continued. It was rhythmic, deliberate. My curiosity got the better of me. I took a few hesitant steps toward the mantel and reached out to touch the box. The moment my fingers brushed against the wood, the scratching stopped. I pulled back, my hand trembling. What the hell was going on? I felt a chill run down my spine, but I told myself it was just a prank, some weird joke someone was playing on me. I picked up the box, half expecting it to feel warm or vibrate under my touch, but it was just a box, cold and solid. I placed it back on the mantel and went back to bed, determined to ignore it. But sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that scratching sound, louder and more insistent. I pulled the covers over my head like a child hiding from a nightmare and finally drifted off into an uneasy sleep. The next day, I tried to go about my routine as usual. I went to work, chatted with my coworkers, did my grocery shopping, all while trying to push the box and the strange sounds out of my mind. By the time I got home, I had almost convinced myself it was just a figment of my imagination. But when I walked into the living room, I noticed something different. The box wasn't on the mantel where I had left it. It was on the coffee table, the lock facing me as if it were waiting. I felt a jolt of fear. I lived alone. No one else had been in the house. How had it moved? I picked it up again, looking around the room as if expecting to see someone hiding in the shadows. But there was no one, just me and the box. I decided I'd had enough. I was going to get rid of it. I grabbed my coat and keys, took the box, and drove to the nearest dumpster. I tossed it in without a second thought and drove back home, feeling relieved. That night, I slept soundly, free of any strange noises or scratching sounds. The next morning, I woke up feeling refreshed. I went downstairs, humming to myself as I made coffee, but when I walked into the living room, I felt my heart stop. The box was back on the mantel. I blinked, thinking I was still dreaming, but no, it was there, exactly where I had found it the first time. I couldn't breathe. This wasn't possible. I had thrown it away, I was sure of it. But here it was, sitting innocently, as if it had never left. My hands were shaking as I approached it. I reached out and touched the box, half expecting it to vanish under my fingers. But it was real, solid cold. The scratching started again, soft and insistent. I jerked my hand back, stumbling away from the mantel. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was losing my mind. I called my best friend, Emma. She came over right away, and I showed her the box. I told her everything, about the delivery, the sounds, how it had moved on its own. She looked skeptical but concerned. "Maybe you're just stressed," she suggested gently. "It's probably nothing, just some trick of the mind." I wanted to believe her, but I knew what I had heard, what I had seen. Emma tried to open the box, but the lock wouldn't budge. She shook it, held it up to the light, but there was no indication of what was inside. "Why don't you keep it?" I offered, desperate to get rid of it. "Just take it with you. Maybe it'll stop." Emma hesitated but finally agreed. She took the box home with her, promising to call me if anything weird happened. That night, I slept peacefully for the first time in days. The next morning, my phone rang. It was Emma. "Did you come by my place last night?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No. Why?" "The box? It's gone." I felt a wave of nausea. "What do you mean?" "It disappeared. I left it in the living room, but when I woke up, it was gone. My front door was unlocked, and I thought maybe you had taken it back, but—" I assured her I hadn't been anywhere near her place. We both sat in silence for a moment, the reality of the situation sinking in. After hanging up, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over me. I went downstairs, half expecting to see the box waiting for me in the living room, but it wasn't there. I felt a small sense of relief. Maybe it was really gone this time. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. The scratching. Louder now, more frantic. I pulled the covers over my head, my heart racing. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see if it was back. But I had to know. I tiptoed out of bed, my hands shaking as I turned on the light. I slowly made my way downstairs, each step feeling like an eternity. I turned the corner into the living room, and there it was, the box, sitting on the coffee table, the lock glinting in the dim light. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a hammer from the garage, determined to break the lock. I didn't care what was inside. I just needed to end this. I swung the hammer down, but the lock didn't break. I tried again, putting all my strength into it, but it was no use. The lock was unbreakable. Frustrated and terrified, I threw the hammer across the room and collapsed on the floor, sobbing. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped, like the box was taunting me, holding some terrible secret that I couldn't uncover. That's when I heard the whisper, "Let me out." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was coming from the box, a faint, desperate whisper. "Let me out," it said again, the voice pleading, almost human. I shook my head, covering my ears. No, this isn't real," I muttered to myself, rocking back and forth. "It's just a nightmare." But the whisper continued, growing louder, more insistent. "Please, let me out. I'm trapped." I stumbled to my feet and ran upstairs, slamming the door behind me. I locked myself in my room, huddled under the blankets like a child hiding from a monster. But the whisper followed me, echoing in my mind. The next day, I called Emma again. I told her everything about the whisper, the way the box seemed to be haunting me. She listened, her voice filled with concern. "You need to get rid of it," she said. "Take it far away, somewhere it can't find its way back to you." I nodded, though she couldn't see me. I knew she was right. I needed to get rid of the box once and for all. I drove out to the woods that evening, the box sitting in the passenger seat beside me. The scratching was louder now, more frantic, like whatever was inside knew I was trying to get rid of it. I stopped at a clearing deep in the forest where no one would find it. I dug a hole as deep as I could, my hands shaking the whole time. I dropped the box in and covered it with dirt, pressing the soil down until the box was buried out of sight. I stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, waiting for something to happen. But there was only silence. The air felt heavy, oppressive, but the scratching was gone. I left the woods feeling lighter, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I drove home in silence, hoping this would be the end of it. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the silence of the house. There was no scratching, no whispers, just the soft hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the creak of the old pipes. I let out a sigh of relief and closed my eyes, feeling the tension drain from my body. I was finally free. But then I heard it, a soft, muffled scratching sound coming from outside the window. My heart stopped. I turned on the light, my hands trembling as I pulled back the curtain. There, on the window ledge, was the box. Covered in dirt, the lock still intact. I stumbled back, falling to the floor. This couldn't be happening. It was impossible. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and then I heard the whisper again. "Let me out." I grabbed the box, my mind racing. I ran downstairs, threw open the front door, and hurled it into the street. I stood there, panting, staring at the box lying in the middle of the road. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't get rid of it, couldn't break the lock. I felt helpless, trapped in some twisted game that I couldn't escape. I walked back inside, my hands shaking, and locked the door behind me. I sat on the couch, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. It was almost dawn when I heard it again. The whisper, soft and desperate. "Please, let me out." I felt a tear roll down my cheek. I didn't know what was inside the box, but I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I had to end it, one way or another. I grabbed the box from the street, brought it inside, and sat down at the kitchen table. My hands were shaking as I reached for the lock. I knew it wouldn't open, but I had to try. To my surprise, the lock clicked open with ease. I hesitated, my heart racing. I took a deep breath and lifted the lid. The room went dark. I felt a cold, suffocating presence wrap around me, and then I saw it, a figure, tall and shadowy, emerging from the box. Its eyes glowed red, and its mouth twisted into a wicked grin. "Thank you," it whispered, its voice like ice. "You've set me free." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow moved closer, its form shifting and twisting like smoke. And then everything went black. The next morning, the house was silent. The box was gone, and so was I. They found my body days later, slumped over the kitchen table, my eyes wide open in terror. No one knew what had happened, but they all felt the same cold, heavy air that lingered in the house. And if you listen closely, sometimes, late at night, you can still hear it, the soft, desperate whisper. "Let me out." I work for a local delivery company, driving around town, dropping off packages, and pretty much doing the same thing every day. It's a simple job, and I like it. But today, something was different. It was late in the evening, and I was exhausted from my shift. I had just finished delivering my last package and was about to head back to the depot when I noticed something odd. There was a small box sitting in the back of my truck, nestled between some crumpled delivery sheets and an old jacket I keep back there for chilly nights. I was confused. I thought I had already delivered everything. Curious, I picked it up. It was a plain brown box, the kind we see all the time, but this one had my name and address on it. There was no return address, no sender's name, nothing. Just my name, in neat, precise handwriting that sent a shiver down my spine. For a moment, I thought it was some kind of prank. Maybe one of the guys at the depot was messing with me. But there was something about the box that felt wrong. The weight of it, the way it felt cold to the touch despite the warm evening. I decided to take it home. Maybe it was a mistake, and I could figure it out later. When I got home, I put the box on my kitchen table and stared at it for a while. My apartment was small, just a single bedroom place, but it was enough for me. Usually, I felt comfortable there, but tonight, everything felt off. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed a knife and carefully cut the tape sealing the box. My heart was pounding, and I felt a cold sweat forming on my forehead. I opened the flaps and peered inside. There was a small wooden box, like a jewelry box, and a folded piece of paper. I took out the box first. It was beautifully crafted, smooth to the touch, with strange symbols carved into the lid. It didn't feel like something you'd just leave at the end of a shift. I opened it carefully, half expecting something to jump out at me. Inside was a ring. A simple silver band with a black stone embedded in it. It looked old, and as soon as I touched it, a chill ran through my fingers. Next, I unfolded the paper. The handwriting was the same as on the outside of the package. It read, "Wear the ring and see the truth, but be warned, the truth is not what it seems." I put the paper down, my mind racing. This had to be some kind of sick joke. But who would go to so much trouble? And why me? I should have left the ring alone. I should have thrown it away, or better yet, called the police. But I didn't. I was too curious, too drawn to it. I slipped the ring onto my finger. At first, nothing happened. I felt a bit foolish, standing there in my kitchen, staring at this stupid ring. Then my vision blurred, and the room seemed to stretch and bend around me. I blinked, thinking I was just tired, but when I opened my eyes, I wasn't in my kitchen anymore. I was standing in the middle of a dark, empty street. It was night, but there were no stars, no moon. Just darkness and a heavy fog that seemed to press in on me from all sides. I looked around, heart pounding. I recognized the place. It was the street where I lived, but it was different, twisted somehow. The buildings were taller, looming over me like they were watching. And then I saw them. Figures, shadowy and indistinct, standing in the fog. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. Just stood there staring at me. I wanted to scream to run, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were stuck to the ground. One of the figures stepped forward. As it got closer, I saw its face, or rather, the lack of it. It was a hollow, featureless mask of darkness. It raised a hand, and I felt a cold touch on my chest, like icy fingers digging into my heart. I woke up on the floor of my kitchen, gasping for breath. The ring was still on my finger, cold and heavy. I ripped it off and threw it across the room. What the hell had just happened? The next few days were a blur. I didn't wear the ring again, but I couldn't get rid of it either. I tried throwing it away, but it was back on my table the next morning. I tried leaving it at the depot, but it was in my pocket by the time I got home. No matter what I did, it wouldn't leave me. And the visions didn't stop. Every night, I found myself back in that twisted version of my neighborhood. The shadowy figures were always there, watching, waiting. I could feel them getting closer, feel their cold presence pressing in on me. I started seeing things during the day too. Out of the corner of my eye, I'd catch a glimpse of a dark figure, only for it to vanish when I turned my head. My reflection in the mirror would smile at me, even when I wasn't smiling. The shadows in my apartment seemed to move on their own, creeping along the walls like living things. I was losing my mind. I knew it, but I couldn't stop it. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the ring, slipped it on, and screamed at the shadows, demanding they show me the truth. I don't know what I expected, but it wasn't this. The world shifted around me, and I found myself standing in a room I didn't recognize. It was cold and dark, with walls covered in strange, twisted symbols. In the center of the room was a table, and on the table lay another box, just like the one I had received. I walked over, heart hammering in my chest. My hands were shaking as I opened the box. Inside was a picture of me, lying on the floor of my kitchen, the ring still on my finger. I was dead. My eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling, my face twisted in a final silent scream. I dropped the picture, stumbling back, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of sick joke, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The shadows closed in around me, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat, the ring still on my finger. I was alive. But for how long? The next day, I went to work like usual. I didn't know what else to do. Everything felt surreal, like I was walking through a dream. When I got to the depot, there was another package waiting for me. It was the same as before, plain brown box, no return address. My name was on it, in that same neat handwriting. I didn't want to open it, but I knew I had to. My hands were shaking as I cut the tape and lifted the flaps. Inside was another ring, identical to the one I was already wearing, and a note. The first was a warning. The second is a promise. I felt a cold dread settle over me. What did it mean? A promise of what? That night, I had the worst vision yet. I was standing in my apartment, but it was empty, abandoned. Dust covered everything, and the windows were shattered. The shadows were everywhere, whispering, laughing. I turned around, and there, standing in the middle of the room, was me, or something that looked like me. It smiled, a twisted, mocking smile, and raised its hand. On its finger was the second ring. And then it spoke. "Welcome home." I woke up screaming, the sound echoing through my empty apartment. I looked at the ring on my finger, feeling its cold weight. I knew what I had to do. I drove out of town, to the middle of nowhere, the 2 rings in my pocket. I found an old, abandoned well, the kind you see in horror movies. It was deep, dark, and looked like it hadn't been used in years. I took the rings out, holding them over the edge of the well. For a moment, I hesitated. I could feel the darkness inside them, the cold malevolence that had been haunting me. Then I let them go. They fell, disappearing into the darkness below. I stood there, breathing heavily, feeling like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. But as I turned to leave, I felt it. A cold, clammy hand on my shoulder. I froze, my heart stopping in my chest. Slowly, I turned around. There, standing in the shadow of the well, was the figure from my visions. It was smiling, the same twisted smile I had seen on my double. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. "The truth is already inside you." I stumbled back, fear gripping my heart. I ran to my truck, jumping in and slamming the door. I drove away as fast as I could, not daring to look back. But I knew it was still there. I don't remember much of the drive home. It's all a blur. By the time I got back to my apartment, it was already morning. I collapsed on my bed, exhausted, and fell into a restless sleep. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the cold. The second was the weight on my finger. The rings were back. Both of them, one on each hand. The darkness inside them pulsed, a cold, steady rhythm that matched the beating of my heart. I felt a scream rising in my throat, but I couldn't let it out. I just stared at the rings, feeling the cold seep into my bones. And then I knew. The truth was inside me. It had always been inside me. The rings were just a doorway, a way to let the darkness in. I don't know how much time I have left. The visions are getting worse, the shadows more real. I can feel them closing in, whispering, laughing. I don't know what's going to happen. Maybe the shadows will take me, or maybe I'll become one of them. Maybe I already am. But one thing I do know. The package was never meant to be delivered. It was meant to be found. When I was 13, I told my first real lie. Not the kind of lie where you say you finished your homework when you hadn't, or that you brushed your teeth when you were too lazy. This was the kind of lie that had weight to it, the kind that made me feel a little sick inside. I remember it clearly because it was the day my dog, Max, went missing. I was supposed to take him out for a walk, but I was too busy playing video games. When my mom asked me if I had taken him out, I just blurted out, "Yeah, I did." I didn't even think twice. But as soon as the words left my mouth, something strange happened. The temperature in the room dropped, just slightly. Enough for me to notice, but not enough for anyone else to. My mom just nodded and went back to her chores, but I felt a shiver run down my spine. I shrugged it off and kept playing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, when I went to bed, I noticed something odd. My room looked different. The posters on the wall were the same, my bed was in the same place, but there was something off. The shadows seemed darker, and my closet door, which I always kept closed, was slightly ajar. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I got up, closed the closet door, and jumped back into bed. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I knew, it was morning. But Max was still missing. Over the next few days, I told myself it wasn't my fault. Max would come back. He always did. But as time passed, I started to notice other things changing around the house. Small things at first. The kitchen light flickered more often, and the old grandfather clock in the hallway started ticking louder than usual. One day, my mom asked if I had seen her favorite necklace. She was sure she'd left it on her dresser, but now it was gone. Without thinking, I lied again. No, I haven't seen it. As soon as I said it, there was a loud bang from upstairs. My mom jumped, her face pale. What was that? She asked. I shrugged, pretending not to know, but my heart was racing. I went upstairs, pretending to check it out. When I got to my room, I found my mirror shattered on the floor. The strange thing was, it didn't look like it had fallen off the wall. It looked like something had smashed it from the inside. I stood there, staring at the broken glass. My reflection was fragmented, pieces of me scattered across the floor. And then I saw it, the closet door, slightly ajar again. I felt my blood run cold. I closed the closet door, making sure it was shut tight, and went back downstairs. I didn't tell my mom what I found. I couldn't. She would think I was crazy. But I wasn't crazy. Something was happening, something that I couldn't explain. And it all seemed to be tied to my lies. Over the next few weeks, I tried to avoid lying. I really did. But sometimes it just slipped out. Like when I told my dad I had finished my homework, or when I told my friend Mike that I was feeling sick, so I wouldn't have to hang out. Every time I lied, something in the house changed. My dad's favorite chair, the one he always sat in to watch TV, was suddenly on the opposite side of the room. The family photos in the hallway started to warp, our faces distorting into strange, unrecognizable shapes. One night, I heard whispering. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. I lay in bed, straining to hear the words, but they were just out of reach. It sounded like a conversation, but I couldn't make out what was being said. I pulled the covers over my head and squeezed my eyes shut, praying it would stop. But it didn't. The whispers followed me. In the kitchen, in the living room, even in the bathroom. I'd catch snippets of them, just at the edge of my hearing. I started sleeping with the lights on, but it didn't help. The house was alive with voices, and they were getting louder. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't keep lying, but it was more than that. I needed to find Max. Maybe if I found him, everything would go back to normal. So I started searching. I put up posters, asked the neighbors, but no one had seen him. I spent hours wandering the neighborhood, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. I was starting to lose hope when I remembered something. The woods behind our house. I'd never taken Max there, but maybe he'd wandered off. It was getting dark, but I didn't care. I grabbed a flashlight and headed into the trees. The woods were thick and quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched. I called out for Max, my voice sounding small and hollow in the stillness. I don't know how long I wandered, but eventually I found something. Not Max, but his color. It was lying on the ground, half buried in the dirt. I picked it up, my hands shaking. There was no sign of him, no footprints, nothing. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, standing at the edge of the trees. It was tall and thin, too tall to be a person. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. The shadow didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there watching me. I don't remember running home, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, I was bursting through the front door, gasping for breath. My mom looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "What's wrong?" she asked. I couldn't tell her. How could I? I just shook my head and went to my room. But I knew, deep down, that whatever was happening, it wasn't just in my head. Things escalated quickly after that. The changes in the house became more extreme. Doors that used to lead to one room now opened into others. The wallpaper in the living room started peeling, revealing strange symbols etched into the walls beneath. The whispers turned into voices, clear and loud. They spoke in a language I didn't understand, but I knew they were talking about me. I could feel their eyes on me, feel them watching my every move. One night, I woke up to find my bed in the hallway. I was lying there, in the dark, staring up at the ceiling, and I knew that something had moved me. I scrambled out of bed and ran to my parents' room, but their door wouldn't open. I pounded on it, screaming for them, but there was no answer. The house seemed to be closing in around me, the walls shifting and bending. I turned and ran down the stairs, tripping over my own feet in my panic. When I reached the bottom, I saw him. Max. He was standing in the living room, his fur matted and dirty. I called out to him, relief flooding through me, but he didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me with empty eyes. And then he opened his mouth, and a voice that wasn't his said, "Why did you lie?" I stumbled back, my heart racing. The room was spinning, the walls twisting and warping. I felt like I was falling, and then everything went black. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat. My room was back to normal, the house silent. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, but then I saw it. A piece of paper on my bedside table with a single sentence scrawled across it in shaky handwriting. "You can't escape your lies." I stared at the words, my mind racing. I knew then that whatever was happening, it was my fault. My lies had done this. They had twisted the house, turned it into something dark and dangerous. I needed to tell the truth. I needed to fix this. I ran to my parents' room, ready to confess everything. But when I opened the door, I stopped dead. The room was empty. The bed was made, their clothes were gone, but there was no sign of them. Panicking, I searched the house, calling their names, but they were gone. The only thing I found was another note, lying on the kitchen counter. "You did this." I sank to the floor, my head in my hands. I had to make it right. I had to find them, but I didn't know how. I spent days searching, but there was no sign of my parents. The house was falling apart around me, the walls crumbling, the air thick with the smell of decay. I was running out of time. One night, as I sat in the living room, staring at the empty space where my dad's chair used to be, I realized what I had to do. The only way to end this was to tell the truth. But I was afraid. Afraid of what might happen, of what I might have to face. So I lied one last time. "I'm not scared," I whispered to the empty room. And the house exploded. The walls shattered, the floor crumbling beneath me. I was falling, tumbling through darkness, the voices screaming in my ears. I tried to grab onto something, but there was nothing there. And then I was standing in the woods again, the shadow looming in front of me. It reached out, its hand cold and skeletal, and I felt its fingers wrap around my throat. "You lied," it whispered, its voice echoing through the darkness. "And now you'll pay the price." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The darkness closed in around me, suffocating, crushing. And then there was nothing. When I opened my eyes, I was lying in my bed. The house was quiet, the air still. For a moment, I thought I was dead. But then I heard it. A faint, familiar sound. Footsteps coming from the hallway. I sat up, my heart pounding. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I held my breath, waiting, but they stopped just outside my door. And then the whisper came, soft and sinister. "You can't escape your lies." I knew then that it wasn't over, that it would never be over. The house was alive, feeding off my lies, growing stronger with every false word. And no matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried, I could never make it right. Because I was a liar, and this was my punishment. I'm still here, trapped in this house of lies. The walls are crumbling, the voices are louder than ever, and the shadow is always watching. I can't leave, can't escape. Every time I try, the house pulls me back, twisting and bending, warping reality around me. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. The lies are consuming me, eating away at my sanity. And I'm afraid. Afraid that one day I'll forget the truth entirely. And then I'll be lost, just like Max, just like my parents. Lost in the darkness, with no way out. So if you're reading this, if you ever find this house, stay away. Don't lie. Because once you start, you can never stop. And the house will never let you go. When my wife Sarah and I decided to leave the hustle and bustle of the city, we were looking for a place to start fresh. We wanted a quieter, slower-paced life where we could escape the stress that had been plaguing us for years. That's how we stumbled upon Fairhaven, a quaint little town tucked away in the middle of nowhere, with a population barely scratching 500. It was the kind of place you'd see on postcards or in those old-fashioned movies. The perfect escape, or so we thought. The moment we arrived, I knew something was off. As soon as we drove past the town sign, I noticed the people on the streets. They were all smiling and waving as if they knew us. At first, I thought it was just small-town friendliness. But then, as we pulled up to the local diner for a quick bite, things started to feel strange. "Hey there, Mike, Sarah." The waitress greeted us with a broad smile as soon as we walked in. I was taken aback. We hadn't introduced ourselves, and yet she knew our names. Sarah and I exchanged puzzled glances but shrugged it off, assuming she had somehow overheard us talking or seen our names on some reservation list. The town felt almost too welcoming. Strangers greeted us by name wherever we went. It wasn't just the waitress at the diner, the guy at the gas station, the librarian, even the old lady walking her dog down the street. All of them seemed to know exactly who we were. We hadn't even unpacked our bags, and we were already treated like long-lost neighbors. By the time we reached our new home, an old Victorian house we had found online, I couldn't shake off the unease. It felt like we had walked into some sort of eerie version of Cheers, where everybody knew our names, but we knew no one. "Do you think they're just friendly?" Sarah asked, though her voice was tinged with doubt. She was trying to make sense of it all, just like I was. "Maybe. But it's weird, right?" I said, setting down our suitcase. "How could they all know us? We've never been here before." She nodded, and we left it at that, chalking it up to a small-town quirk we'd eventually get used to. But something deep down told me there was more to it than that. The next morning, we decided to explore the town, hoping to get a better sense of our new community. It was a bright, sunny day, and the main street looked almost picturesque with its neatly lined shops and the smell of freshly baked bread wafting through the air. "Morning, Mike, Sarah. How was your first night in the old Wilkins house?" A man in his late 60s called out as we walked past the hardware store. I turned to Sarah, and she looked just as confused as I felt. We had never told anyone where we were staying. The house had been vacant for years, according to the real estate agent, and it wasn't exactly common knowledge. "It was good, thanks," I replied hesitantly, forcing a smile. "You're going to love it here," he continued. "You know, your grandmother used to live in that house. I remember her well." I froze. My grandmother? That didn't make any sense. My grandparents had lived states away, and they had never mentioned Fairhaven. "I think you've got me confused with someone else," I said politely. The man chuckled. "Oh no, I know the Brooks family well. You're just like your father." I felt a chill run down my spine. How could he possibly know that? I hadn't even mentioned my last name to anyone. I nodded awkwardly and quickly pulled Sarah along. We spent the rest of the day wandering around town, but no matter where we went, the same unsettling thing happened. Everyone seemed to know us. Not just our names, but intimate details about our lives, where we had gone to college, what jobs we had left behind in the city, even the fact that Sarah had always wanted to open a small bakery. It was as if they had been expecting us, and that thought terrified me. That night, we decided to do some digging. If everyone in town knew so much about us, maybe the house itself held some clues. The old Victorian had a strange charm to it, with its creaky floors and antique furniture. It felt like stepping back in time. We found ourselves in the attic, going through boxes of old photographs, letters, and what seemed like decades' worth of newspaper clippings. It was there that we found it, a faded photograph of a couple standing in front of our house. They looked eerily familiar. The man had my eyes, and the woman looked like an older version of Sarah. "What the hell?" Sarah whispered, holding the photograph up to the light. "That's impossible," I muttered, my heart racing. There was no way that was us. And yet, the resemblance was uncanny. We flipped the photo over, and my blood ran cold when I read the back. It was dated 1923. The names written were Michael and Sarah Brooke. "That's our names," I said, almost shouting. "What is going on here?" Before we could process it any further, we heard a noise from downstairs. It sounded like footsteps. We exchanged a look, fear evident in both of our eyes. Slowly, we crept down the stairs, the creaking floorboards betraying our every step. The house was empty, but the front door was wide open. I could have sworn we had locked it. We searched every room, but there was no one there. Just the suffocating silence of an old house with too many secrets. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and fear. We started hearing whispers at night, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The townsfolk continued to greet us as if they had known us all their lives, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. We tried to leave once, but as we drove down the only road out of town, we found ourselves back at the entrance, staring at the sign that read, "Welcome to Fairhaven." We tried again and again, but it was as if the town wouldn't let us go. Desperate, we sought out the town historian, a reclusive woman named Edith, who who lived in a small cottage on the outskirts. She was the only person who didn't greet us by name when we knocked on her door. "I was wondering when you'd come," she said, her voice raspy and tired. She gestured for us to sit down, her eyes never leaving ours. "You're not the first." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. She sighed and handed us an old book. It was a ledger of sorts, filled with names and dates. Our names were there, listed multiple times over the decades, each with a different date of arrival. "This town," she began, "it's not like other places. It has a way of drawing people back. People like you." "People like us?" Sarah echoed, her voice barely a whisper. Edith nodded. "Yes, you've been here before many times. Each time you leave, but you always come back. It's a cycle." "That's impossible," I said, my mind reeling. "We've never been here before. We're not. We can't be the same people." "And yet you are," Edith said quietly. "The town remembers, even if you don't." We left Edith's cottage more confused than ever. Our minds were spinning with her words. Was it true? Had we really lived in Fairhaven before? And if so, why couldn't we remember? Back at the house, we tried to piece it all together. There had to be a reason why the town knew us so well, why we were drawn here, and why we couldn't leave. That night, we made a decision. If the town was trapping us, we'd find a way to break free. We packed our bags, grabbed everything we could carry, and made our way to the car. But as we stepped outside, we found the entire town gathered in our front yard. "Where are you going, Mike? Sarah?" The man from the hardware store called out, his voice eerily calm. "We're leaving," I said, my voice shaking. "We're leaving this town for good." The crowd murmured, their expressions shifting from friendly to something darker. "You can't leave," someone said from the back. "You belong here. Don't you see?" The waitress from the diner stepped forward, her smile gone. "You're a part of Fairhaven. You always have been." I felt Sarah's grip tighten on my arm. "What do you want from us?" she cried out. The townsfolk didn't answer. Instead, they just stood there, watching us with those vacant eyes. It was then that I realized they weren't going to let us go. Desperate, we ran back into the house and bolted the door. We could hear them outside, their voices growing louder, more insistent. The whispers we had been hearing for days now surrounded us, filling the air with their chilling presence. We barricaded ourselves in the living room, clutching each other as the house seemed to come alive around us. The walls creaked and groaned, and the temperature dropped. I could see my breath fogging in the air. "We need to end this," Sarah said, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to find out what's keeping us here." We made our way back to the attic, to the box of photographs and letters. There had to be something we missed, something that would explain why we were trapped in this nightmare. That's when we found it. A diary hidden beneath a loose floorboard. It belonged to the original Michael Brooke, the man who looked just like me. His entries were erratic, filled with ramblings about the town and a toll on him and his wife. He spoke of a ritual, something that bound them to Fairhaven, something that they could never escape. "The ritual can be broken," the final entry read. "But the cost? It's too high. I can't do it. I can't lose her." My hands shook as I read the words. "What do you think it means?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. I shook my head. "I don't know, but we have to try." We searched the house, looking for anything that might be linked to this ritual. It was in the basement that we found it, a small, hidden room behind a false wall. Inside, there was a circle drawn on the floor, symbols carved into the stone. In the center was a box, small and unassuming. My heart raced as I approached it. I could feel the air around me growing heavier, the whispers louder. With trembling hands, I opened the box. Inside was a pair of wedding rings, our rings. "This is it," I whispered. "This is what's keeping us here." "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. I looked at her, tears in my eyes. "We have to destroy them." With a heavy heart, I took the rings and threw them into the fireplace. The moment they touched the flames, the house shook violently. The whispers turned into screams, and the air around us seemed to crackle with energy. "It's working," Sarah shouted over the noise. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The house fell silent, and the flames in the fireplace died out. I turned to Sarah, relief flooding through me. "We did it," I said, pulling her into my arms. But as I held her, I felt something cold and sharp against my back. I pulled away, staring at her in shock. Her eyes were blank, her expression empty. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I have to do this." Before I could react, she plunged the knife into my chest. The pain was blinding, and I fell to the floor, gasping for breath. "Why?" I managed to choke out, my vision blurring. "Because you broke the cycle," she said, her voice distant. "And now I have to take your place." As I lay there, bleeding out on the cold basement floor, I realized the truth. The town hadn't trapped us here. It was us who had trapped each other. Each time we returned, it was because we had failed to break the curse. And now, Sarah would be bound to Fairhaven, just as I had been before. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was her face, her tears falling onto mine. I wanted to tell her I loved her, that I was sorry, but I couldn't find the words. And then there was nothing. The next day, the town was abuzz with the news. The old Wilkins house had claimed another victim. The townsfolk gathered in the square, whispering among themselves. But no one spoke of the woman who stood in the shadows, watching with hollow eyes. She would be the next to greet the newcomers, to welcome them to Fairhaven. Because in this town, everyone knew your name. I've been a late-night radio host for almost a decade now. It's not the most glamorous job in the world, but there's something about the silence of the night that makes the callers more honest, more real. My show, Midnight Musings, catered to the insomniacs, the lonely souls, and the occasional conspiracy theorist. You'd be surprised by the stories people share when they think no one's listening. It was a typical Thursday night, or maybe Friday morning. You lose track of time when you're on the graveyard shift. The studio lights cast a dull glow, and the only sound was the gentle hum of the equipment. I was midway through a discussion on urban legends when the phone lines lit up. "Looks like we have a caller," I said into the microphone. "You're on with Luke. What's on your mind tonight?" There was a pause, then a faint crackle before a voice came through. It was soft, almost a whisper, and it sent a shiver down my spine. "Do you believe in ghosts, Luke?" I chuckled. "Well, that depends. Are we talking about the kind that rattle chains, or the kind that haunt your memories?" "No chains," the voice replied, "but I have been haunting memories for a long time." There was something about the way they spoke that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced at the screen to check the caller ID, but it just read unknown. "Interesting," I said, leaning back in my chair. "So, are you calling to share a ghost story?" A soft laugh came through the line, almost like a sigh. "You could say that. I've been trying to reach someone, and I think you're the only one who can hear me." I frowned. "Why's that?" "Because I've been dead for 50 years. I paused, caught off guard by the statement. I've had prank callers before, but something about this one felt different. There was a weight to the words, a sadness that seeped through the static. "Dead for 50 years, huh? That's quite a claim. Got any proof?" "Proof?" The voice seemed amused. "How about I tell you something you've never shared on air? Something personal." I glanced around the empty studio, the shadows creeping at the edges of my vision. "All right, go ahead. You used to have a dog named Max. He died when you were 12. You never told anyone, not even your parents, how much you cried that night." My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't thought about Max in years. There was no way anyone could have known that, let alone a random caller in the middle of the night. How did you know that?" "I listened, Luke." "I've been listening for a long time." The line went dead before I could ask anything else. I sat there, staring at the blinking cursor on my monitor, a cold sweat forming on my forehead. The rest of the night passed in a blur, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The next night, I was more prepared. I had convinced myself that it was just a prank, some listener with too much time on their hands. But part of me couldn't shake the unease. I kept glancing at the phone lines, half expecting them to light up again. And they did. "Midnight Musings, you're on with Luke," I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hello, Luke," the same soft voice replied. "Did you miss me?" I felt a chill run down my spine. "You again. Look, if this is a joke, it's not funny." "No joke." "I just wanted to talk. It gets lonely, being dead." I swallowed hard. "Who are you?" "My name was Sarah. I died in a car accident in 1973, just outside of town. Do you remember the old bridge? Yeah, but they tore it down years ago. Yes, they did. But sometimes I still feel like I'm there, trapped in that moment. I leaned forward, my pulse quickening. Why are you calling me? Because I need your help. I need someone to remember. After that call, I couldn't focus on anything else. I spent the weekend researching every car accident from 1973. It took hours, but I finally found her, Sarah Miller, a 22-year-old who died when her car went off the old bridge on a foggy night. There were no other details, just a small obituary in the local paper. I stared at her picture. A black and white photo of a young woman with a shy smile. How could she be calling me? Monday night, I was back in the studio, my heart racing as I waited for the show to start. I didn't have to wait long. The phone rang just as I was signing on. Sarah? I asked hesitantly. Yes, it's me, she replied. Did you find me? I did, but I still don't understand. Why me? Why now? Because you listen, Luke, and I need someone to listen, to remember that I was here. I took a deep breath. What do you want me to do? Just keep talking to me, please. It's been so long since I've heard a friendly voice. Over the next few weeks, Sarah called every night. We talked about everything, her life, her dreams, the things she missed. I found myself looking forward to her calls, even as I questioned my sanity. How could I be talking to a dead woman? But it felt real. Too real. She knew things she shouldn't have known. She described places in town that had changed, people who had come and gone. And every time she asked me to remember, to say her name on air, to tell her story. So I did. I started sharing bits and pieces, little anecdotes about her life. I didn't mention she was a ghost, of course, but I could feel her presence in every word I spoke. The listeners loved it. They called in, sharing their own memories, their own stories of loss. It was like Sarah had opened a door, and everyone was stepping through, eager to connect. But not everyone was happy. One night, I received an email. It was from someone claiming to be Sarah's brother. He was furious, accusing me of exploiting his sister's memory for ratings. Stop talking about her, the email read. She's gone. Let her rest. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Was I doing the right thing? Was I really helping her, or was I just using her for my show? But then the phone rang, and I knew it was her. Don't listen to him, she said, her voice trembling. He never understood. He didn't care. You're the only one who listens, Luke. Please, don't stop. I closed my eyes, torn between doubt and something else, something deeper. I wanted to help her, but I also wanted to believe. Okay, I whispered. I won't stop. It was a Friday night, a month after Sarah's first call. The show was almost over, and I was exhausted. I hadn't been sleeping well, haunted by dreams of the old bridge, of Sarah's voice calling out to me. And then the phone rang. Luke, she whispered, I'm so tired. My heart clenched. What's wrong? I think it's time for me to go. But I'm scared. I don't know what's next. Sarah, my voice broke. I didn't know what to say. Just tell me you'll remember me. Please. I swallowed hard, tears stinging my eyes. I'll remember you, Sarah. I promise. Thank you, she whispered, her voice fading. Goodbye, Luke. And then the line went dead. The next night, the phone didn't ring. Or the night after that. I felt empty, like a part of me had been ripped away. I kept replaying our conversations, wondering if I could have done something, said something to keep her here. But she was gone. A week later, I received another email. It was from Sarah's brother again, but this time it was different. Thank you, it read, for remembering her. I stared at the screen, tears blurring my vision. I had done what she asked. I had remembered. But at what cost? It was my last night on the air. I had decided to quit the show, to move on. I couldn't keep doing this, not after everything that had happened. I signed on, my voice steady even as my heart ached. Tonight's my last night, folks, I said, my throat tight. I want to thank all of you for listening, for sharing your stories. It's been an honor. The phone lines were silent, and for a moment, I thought I'd be going out alone. But then the light blinked. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the button. I knew, somehow, that this was it, the final call. Midnight Musings, you're on with Luke. There was a pause, then a familiar voice, soft and distant. Thank you, Luke. for everything. I closed my eyes, a single tear slipping down my cheek. Goodbye, Sarah. The line went dead, and I sat there, the silence heavy around me. I had done what she asked. I had remembered. And now it was time to let go. I left the studio that night, the cool air washing over me as I stepped outside. The street was empty, the only sound the distant hum of traffic. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of peace. But as I turned to lock the door, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the reflection of the studio window, was a figure. A young woman with a shy smile and sad eyes. Sarah. I blinked, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I looked again, she was gone. I walked home that night, my mind racing. Was it real? Had I really seen her? Or was it just my imagination, a trick of the light? I'll never know. But every now and then, late at night, I'll hear a soft whisper on the wind, a voice calling out to me from the darkness. Remember me, Luke. And I do. I always will. But I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone, that she's still out there, watching, waiting. And that one day she'll come back. For me. I don't know why I decided to clean out the attic that day. Maybe it was boredom or just an urge to organize my chaotic life. The house was old, inherited from my grandparents, and I had been living in it for a few months, trying to get used to its creaky floors and dusty corners. There was something eerie about it, though. I often felt watched, like there was something hiding just out of sight. But I shrugged it off as my imagination. The attic was exactly what you'd expect, dusty, dimly lit, and filled with forgotten boxes. I found old clothes, photo albums, and a few random knickknacks. Nothing out of the ordinary. That's when I stumbled upon a wooden trunk, tucked away in a corner, almost like it didn't want to be found. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pried it open. Inside, neatly stacked, were a series of newspapers. They looked old, the pages yellowed and brittle. What caught my eye was the date on the first one, June 15, 2024. That's tomorrow's date, I thought, confused. I picked it up, careful not to tear it, and began reading. The headline read, Local man wins lottery, but loses ticket. There was a picture of a man holding a big check with a defeated look on his face. I chuckled, thinking it was some sort of prank, an old prop from a school play or something. But then I noticed the details. The address listed was just 2 blocks away from my house. It felt off. Shaking my head, I placed the newspaper back in the trunk and continued rummaging. There were dozens of them, all dated for the upcoming days, weeks, and even months. I didn't think much of it at the time and decided to head back downstairs. The attic had given me enough of the creeps for one day. But that night, something strange happened. I couldn't sleep. The attic kept creeping into my thoughts. I tossed and turned, images of those newspapers flashing in my mind. Finally, around midnight, I gave up and decided to watch some TV. As I flipped through the channels, a news alert caught my attention. Local man wins lottery but loses ticket, the reporter said, followed by an interview with the exact same man from the newspaper. My heart skipped a beat. It was the same story, word for word. I rushed back to the attic, heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed the newspaper, my hands shaking. This couldn't be real. I checked the date again, June 15, 2024. Today, it wasn't possible. I read through the article again, and every single detail matched what I had just seen on TV. I sat there, trying to make sense of it all. Maybe it was a coincidence, I told myself, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I spent the rest of the night reading through more of the newspapers. Some were mundane, like New Bakery opens on Main Street, or High School Team wins championship. Others were more unsettling. Local woman found dead in park. Massive fire destroys apartment complex. I felt like I was going crazy. I had to test it. The next morning, I went to the bakery listed in one of the newspapers. Sure enough, it was bustling with customers on its opening day. My heart raced. This was real. But I had no idea just how dark things were going to get. I became obsessed with the newspapers. Every day, I would read the one for that date, checking to see if the events would unfold as predicted. They always did. I felt like I had stumbled upon something I shouldn't have, like I was peeking into the future, but at a terrible cost. Then one day, I found a newspaper with my name in the headline. Local man dies in car accident. My hands went cold. The date was 3 days from now. I read the article in a daze. It described in detail how I would be driving on Route 15 when a truck would run a red light and slam into my car. It even described what I would be wearing: a blue shirt and jeans. I couldn't breathe. Was this how it all ended for me? Was this why I had found the newspapers to know my own death? I decided I wouldn't let it happen. I would stay home that day, lock myself inside if I had to. I wouldn't drive anywhere. There was no way I was going to die because of some cursed newspaper prediction. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how impossible it was to escape. What if staying home wasn't enough? What if something else happened? I couldn't just sit and wait for death. The next 2 days were a blur. I was paranoid, jumping at every little sound. I avoided driving, taking long walks instead, trying to clear my mind. But everywhere I went, I felt like I was being watched, like someone or something was following me. On the morning of the predicted accident, I woke up in a cold sweat. My hands were shaking as I picked up the newspaper for that day. The headline was the same, but something had changed in the article. There was an additional line at the bottom. Attempts to change fate will only bring it closer. I felt a chill run down my spine. Was this some kind of sick joke? Was someone toying with me? I decided to leave town. I packed a bag and started driving, avoiding Route 15 at all costs. I took the back roads, driving aimlessly, just trying to get as far away as possible. My heart was racing, and every time I saw a truck, I felt like my time was running out. Then it happened. I was driving down a narrow road when I saw a truck coming towards me. I tried to swerve, but the road was too narrow. The truck slammed into my car, and everything went black. I woke up in a hospital, bandages covering my body. I was alive, but barely. I didn't understand. The newspaper said I would die, but here I was, breathing. I should have felt relief, but all I felt was dread. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive, but I knew better. The newspapers were never wrong. I had tried to escape, but it had only brought the accident closer. When I got home, I went straight to the attic. I needed answers. I needed to know what was going on. I rifled through the newspapers, looking for something, anything that would explain this. That's when I found it, a newspaper dated 2 weeks from now. The headline read, "Local man found dead in his home. Suspected suicide." It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I read the article, my heart pounding in my ears. It described how I would be found in my living room, surrounded by newspapers, a gun in my hand. It even mentioned the note I would leave behind. I couldn't escape. I dropped the newspaper, my hands trembling. It was all a lie. There was no escaping it. The newspapers didn't just predict the future, they created it. Every time I tried to change something, it twisted it, brought it closer, made it worse. I was trapped. For the next 2 weeks, I was a shell of a man. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I just sat in my living room, staring at the newspapers. They were everywhere, covering the floor, the walls, like some twisted wallpaper of fate. I knew what was coming, but I couldn't stop it. The newspapers had shown me my end, and now I was just waiting for it. On the day the newspaper predicted my death, I woke up feeling numb. It was like my body had given up. I found the gun where the article said it would be, on the coffee table, next to a blank piece of paper and a pen. I sat down, staring at the gun, my mind a whirlwind of fear and resignation. I didn't want to die, but I knew I didn't have a choice. The newspapers had taken everything from me, my hope, my sanity, my will to live. I picked up the pen, my hand shaking, and wrote the note. I couldn't escape. Then I reached for the gun. As I lifted the gun, a thought crossed my mind. What if I didn't do it? What if I'd fought back just one last time? I put the gun down and laughed, a hollow, desperate sound. I was going crazy, talking to myself, trying to bargain with a fate I couldn't change. But I had to try. I grabbed the newspapers, every single one, and carried them to the backyard. I piled them up, dousing them in gasoline, and set them on fire. The flames rose to life, consuming the papers, the headlines, the future they held. I watched as the fire burned, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I felt free. But then the flames flickered and the fire died down. The newspapers were gone, but the ashes were still there, scattered in the wind. And in the ashes I saw words forming, like some dark magic at work. You cannot escape. I stumbled back, fear gripping me. It was over. I couldn't fight it. I couldn't change it. The newspapers were gone, but the future they held was still there, waiting for me. I walked back into the house, my hands shaking. The gun was still on the coffee table, the note next to it. I sat down, tears streaming down my face. I couldn't escape. And so I did what the newspaper said I would. I picked up the gun, feeling its cold weight in my hand. I closed my eyes, my heart pounding in my ears. And then I pulled the trigger. The last thing I heard was the sound of the gunshot, echoing through the empty house, and then everything went dark.